My name is Lauren, and I am 33 years old. My dad demanded I attend my golden sister's wedding and threatened to cut my tuition if I did not obey. They had no idea I secretly graduated top of my class 2 years ago and made six figures. As a lead mergers and acquisitions consultant, I spent my days dissecting multi-million-dollar corporate frauds, but dealing with my own family was always my most exhausting negotiation. Last Sunday, they invited me to a luxury brunch. I thought we were simply celebrating Brittany getting engaged to Bradley. Instead, my father threw a $20,000 invoice onto my plate and gave me an ultimatum that would end up destroying his entire life. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in a wealthy Chicago suburb, my life was a constant performance. My parents, Richard and Susan, measured success entirely by social status and appearances. My younger sister, Brittany, played their game perfectly. She was 30 years old, beautiful, loud, and proudly unemployed, relying entirely on our parents while she hunted for a wealthy husband. When she found Bradley the heir to a massive tech logistics empire, my parents acted like they had won the lottery. For them, this wedding was not about love. It was a corporate merger designed to elevate our family name into the ultra-elite circles. I took a completely different path. I moved to the city, wore practical suits, and focused on my career. To them, my choices were baffling. They genuinely believed I was a struggling student hopelessly behind in life, relying on their handouts. The brunch took place at an exclusive rooftop restaurant downtown. It was the kind of place where a single omelet cost more than most people make in a full day of hard work. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the crystal glasses and heavy silver cutlery. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a simple tailored blazer that my mother immediately criticized. Susan looked me up and down with that familiar expression of pity and distaste. She wore a pale silk dress and real pearls, looking every inch the wealthy matriarch she desperately wanted to be. Brittany sat next to her, flashing a diamond engagement ring that was heavy enough to cause wrist damage. Richard sat at the head of the table, sipping a Bloody Mary with absolute authority. For the first hour, I sat quietly pushing a fruit tart around my plate, while they discussed expensive floral arrangements and custom ice sculptures. I was used to being the invisible audience to their grand lives. I nodded when spoken to and kept my thoughts to myself. Then the waiter cleared our plates and the atmosphere shifted entirely. Richard reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of thick, heavy stock paper. He did not hand it to me gently. He tossed it across the large table with a dismissive flick of his wrist. The paper landed squarely in the center of my saucer, knocking over my half-full coffee cup. Dark brown liquid spilled across the crisp white linen tablecloth, staining the edges of the thick paper and dripping onto my lap. I grabbed a cloth napkin to dab at my ruined trousers, but nobody offered to help me. Richard simply tapped the damp paper with his index finger. "Pick it up, Lauren," he commanded, his voice loud enough to turn heads at the neighboring tables. I unfolded the wet paper carefully. It was a highly detailed, itemized invoice from a luxury travel concierge service. It listed first-class flights to a private island resort, VIP nightclub, access luxury yacht rentals, and custom designer swimwear for 10 women. The grand total at the bottom was exactly $20,000. I looked up at my father, trying hard to keep my voice perfectly even. "What is this, Dad?" "This is the bill for your sister's destination bachelorette party," he declared, leaning back in his leather chair with a smug, arrogant expression. "And you are going to pay it today." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but his face remained completely serious. Brittany examined her fresh, manicured nails, pretending not to listen, but the pleased smile playing on her lips gave her away completely. Susan took a delicate sip of her mimosa, waiting for my reaction. "Dad, I am not paying $20,000 for a party," I replied, setting the damp paper back on the table. "That is absurd, and you know it." Richard slammed his hand against the table, making the fine silverware rattle loudly against the porcelain plates. It is not absurd, Lauren. It is the absolute minimum you can do to prove your loyalty to this family. You have spent your entire life being a selfish disappointment to us. You are 33 years old and you are still finding yourself. You contribute absolutely nothing to our social standing or our reputation. Paying for this trip is your way of earning your place at her wedding. I looked at my mother expecting some motherly mediation, but she just sighed. Your father is right, Lauren, she added, her voice dripping with fake concern. You have been taking from us for years without giving anything back. Look at your sister. She is marrying a wonderful, successful man and securing her future. Bradley is heir to an important logistics company. His family expects perfection, and you do not fit the picture. Brittany finally spoke up, her tone dripping with venom. Honestly, Lauren, you should be grateful we are letting you come to the ceremony. Your vibe is a social liability to Bradley's relatives. I am doing you a favor by letting you contribute financially, since you obviously cannot contribute socially. I maintained my composure, refusing to give them the emotional reaction they craved from me. I cannot and will not fund a luxury vacation. I am just sorry, but the answer is no. My calm refusal was the spark that ignited his deep fury. His face turned a dark shade of red and the veins in his neck stood out. If you do not pay this bill right now, he threatened, his voice dropping to a menacing, dangerous whisper, I am cutting off my financial support for your final year of tuition today. I will call the university administration myself and pull the funding immediately. He leaned closer across the table, pointing a finger directly at my face. You will not get your business degree. You will remain a 33-year-old dropout and a permanent embarrassment to my name. You will be absolutely nothing. If you want to be treated like family, you need to act like family. You will pay for this trip, and you will stand quietly in the background at the wedding, making sure your sister shines. If you refuse, you are entirely on your own, and I promise you will fail miserably without my financial help protecting you. I just sat there staring at him. What he did not know was that I did not need a single cent from him. I simply smiled, slid the invoice back across the table, and looked him dead in the eye. Do what you have to do, Dad. The only sound at our table was the clinking of silverware. My father stared at me with his mouth slightly open. He was so accustomed to my compliance that my calm defiance simply did not compute. The dark red flush on his neck deepened as he processed my words. He opened his mouth to shout again, but my mother beat him to it. She placed her glass onto the table with a sharp clack and leaned forward. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the edge of the tablecloth. Susan narrowed her eyes at me and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Are you out of your mind, Lauren? She asked, her voice dripping with pure condescension. Your father is giving you a massive opportunity to participate in this family, and you are throwing it in his face. You should be down on your knees thanking him for even offering to keep paying your tuition. You are a 33-year-old woman who still relies on her parents to keep the lights on in that depressing little shoebox you call an apartment. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to constantly defend your choices to our friends? We tell everyone you are finding yourself, but the truth is you are just lazy. Brittany immediately sensed the shift in momentum and seized her chance to pile onto the attack. She adjusted her posture, making sure her massive engagement ring caught the morning sunlight. Honestly, Mom, I do not even know why we try anymore, she said, rolling her eyes. Lauren has always been perfectly content being the family failure. Look at her. She drives a car that makes weird rattling noises and wears clothes that look like they came from a discount rack. Bradley comes from real money. His family has estates in Europe and corporate jets. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is for me to introduce you as my sister? When Bradley's mother asked what you do for a living, I had to lie and say you were in a transition phase. Having you at the wedding is already a massive social liability. His family is going to take one look at your cheap shoes and your complete lack of ambition, and they are going to judge me for it. I'm doing you a massive favor by letting you pay for the bachelorette trip. It is the only way you could possibly add any value to this wedding. You clearly cannot contribute socially, so the least you can do is contribute financially. My father nodded vigorously in agreement with my sister. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with absolute disgust. "Listen to your sister Lauren," he demanded. "She is about to marry into one of the most powerful tech logistics families. She is elevating our entire family name. You, on the other hand, are a dead weight. I have been paying your MBA tuition for years, hoping you would finally get a real job and stop embarrassing us. I send you $1,500 every single month just so you do not end up on the street. If you walk out of here today without paying this invoice, I am calling the university tomorrow. Your funding will be cut immediately. You will not graduate. You will be entirely cut off. Do not think I am bluffing. I will let you drown in your own bad choices until you come crawling back and beg for my forgiveness." I sat in complete silence, enduring their verbal assault. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not rise to their bait. I sat there staring at the damp $20,000 invoice resting on the tablecloth. I let them rant and rave. I let them puff out their chests and parade their imaginary power over me. It was almost comical watching them act so superior when their entire reality was built on a foundation of absolute lies. They truly believed I was a helpless, struggling student terrified of losing my father's monthly allowance. They thought my modest apartment and older car were signs of failure. What Richard did not know was that he had not been paying my tuition for a very long time. I had quietly taken over my own educational finances years ago. I did not just finish my degree. I graduated as the valedictorian of my executive MBA program 2 entire years ago. While they were busy criticizing my choices, I was busy building an empire. I had poured every ounce of my energy into launching my own mergers and acquisitions firm. I worked 80-hour weeks building a network of corporate clients who trusted my ruthless analytical skills. My firm had grown exponentially. We had just cleared $4.5 million in pure revenue this past quarter alone. I was not struggling. I was not a failure. I was a multi-millionaire sitting across from people who thought they could control me with an allowance. As for that $1,500 my father proudly claimed he sent me every month, I had not spent a single dime of his money on myself. When his condescending deposit hit my bank account, I immediately transferred the exact amount to a local shelter. It was a charity providing legal and financial support for women escaping financially abusive relationships. I made the donations entirely in Richard's name. It was my own private joke. The money he used to try and financially abuse his daughter was actively funding the escape plans of women dealing with men exactly like him. I looked at my mother in her pale silk dress. I looked at Brittany clutching her engagement ring. I looked at my father wearing an expression of absolute arrogance. They were so desperate to be part of the elite world. They were willing to crush me just to maintain an illusion of wealth for Bradley's family. I felt no anger anymore. I only felt a deep, cold sense of clarity. Their threats were completely empty. Their power over me was a phantom. I picked up my purse from the chair beside me. I did not bother trying to defend myself. I did not explain about my agency or my bank accounts or my degree. There was no point handing them the truth when their lies were about to blow up in their faces. Let them believe I was a failure. Let them believe they held all the cards. The truth would reveal itself soon enough and be far more devastating than any argument I could start today. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly, smoothing out my tailored blazer. My father glared at me, his face tight with barely contained rage. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life, Lauren," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "If you walk away now, do not expect me to answer the phone when you realize you cannot pay your rent next month. I am entirely serious." I looked down at the three of them. I let a small, genuine smile touch my lips. "I know you are serious, Dad," I said softly, making sure my tone was completely devoid of emotion. "But like I said, you have to do what you have to do. And so do I." I turned on my heel and walked away from the table. I did not look back as I crossed the dining room and stepped into the elevator. 4 days later, my phone buzzed with an address and a strict command to be there at 2:00 sharp. I had spent the days since the brunch deep in corporate financial audits, completely ignoring my father's threatening voicemails. But I decided to show up at the bridal boutique anyway. I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to push this charade. The boutique was located in the most expensive shopping district in the city. It featured frosted glass doors, white marble floors, and attendants carrying silver trays of champagne. It was the exact kind of pretentious environment where my mother and sister thrived. When I walked into the private viewing suite, Brittany was already standing on a velvet pedestal. She was wrapped in a custom silk gown covered in hand-sewn crystals. She looked stunning, and she knew it. My mother stood nearby, wiping a fake tear from her eye. Susan turned to me as I walked in, and her sentimental smile vanished instantly. "You are late, Lauren," she snapped, thrusting a heavy plastic garment bag into my arms. "Go put this on right now. The seamstress charges by the hour, and we do not have time to waste on your dawdling." I took the bag without a word and stepped into the small changing room. When I unzipped the plastic, the heavy smell of cheap synthetic fabric hit my nose. I pulled the dress out and stared at it. It was a monstrosity. The color was a muddy shade of olive green that would wash out absolutely any skin tone. The cut was entirely shapeless, featuring a high, stiff neckline and massive ruffled sleeves that looked like they belonged on a terrible set of curtains. The material was thick and itchy. It was not a dress chosen by accident. It was a dress chosen with malicious precision. It was designed to make me look as frumpy, awkward, and unattractive as humanly possible, standing next to my sister. I stripped off my tailored work clothes and pulled the heavy green fabric over my head. The dress swallowed me whole. It bunched awkwardly at the waist, and the ruffled sleeves dug into my shoulders. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked exactly like the pathetic, struggling failure they desperately wanted me to be. I took a deep breath, smoothed my expression into a mask of complete indifference, and stepped out of the fitting room. Brittany caught sight of me in the mirrors and let out a sharp, cruel bark of laughter. "Oh, wow, Lauren," she giggled, pressing a hand to her mouth. "That is certainly a look. It really highlights your posture." My mother stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with undisguised satisfaction. She waved the seamstress away and grabbed a velvet cushion full of sharp silver pins. "Come here," she commanded. "Let me see what we can do to fix this mess." I walked over and stood rigidly in front of the massive mirrors. Susan stepped behind me and began pulling the stiff fabric with unnecessary force. She yanked the thick waistline tight, causing the rough material to dig sharply into my ribs. She grabbed a handful of fabric near my shoulder and shoved a pin through it. The sharp metal point grazed my collarbone, causing me to flinch. "Stand still, Lauren," she scolded me sharply. "If you had bothered to maintain a decent figure, this would not be so difficult." I looked at my mother in the mirror. She was smiling a tight, triumphant little smile as she aggressively jabbed another pin into the heavy olive fabric. She stepped back to admire her work. The dress still looked completely hideous, but she nodded as if she had accomplished a masterpiece. "It is just like your high school prom, Lauren," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Some girls are meant to shine, and some are meant to hold the coats." The room went completely still. Brittany snickered softly from her pedestal, adjusting her sparkling tiara. My mother stood there waiting for me to lower my eyes. She expected me to shrink into myself just like I always did when I was a teenager. She expected the casual cruelty to keep me exactly where she wanted me, in the background, invisible, ashamed. Instead, I turned around to face her. I did not raise my voice, but the icy tone in my words made my mother take a sudden step backward. "You mean my high school prom where I had to work a double shift at a diner, just to pay for my own bus pass?" I asked her calmly. Susan narrowed her eyes. "Do not start with your revisionist history, Lauren. You chose not to go to prom because you never bothered to make any friends." "No, Mom," I replied, stepping closer to her. "I chose not to go to prom because a week before the dance, I went to the bank to withdraw my college savings and found out the account was empty." I looked directly at Brittany, who suddenly stopped smiling. "Do you remember that? Dad and Mom told me there had been a financial error. They told me I would have to take out student loans to cover my freshman year. I spent my entire senior year working minimum wage jobs, trying to scrape together enough money just to afford my textbooks." My mother crossed her arms defensively. "We did what we had to do for the family. You have always been so dramatic about money. I ignored her excuse and kept my eyes locked on her face. 3 days after I found my account empty, Brittany drove up to the house in a brand new luxury sports car. I said, letting the heavy silence amplify my words. A fully loaded convertible that cost exactly the same amount that had vanished from my college fund. You and Dad drained my entire future to buy your golden child a graduation present. Brittany stepped down from the pedestal, her heavy silk gown rustling loudly. You are just jealous, Lauren, she snapped, her face turning red. You have always been jealous that Mom and Dad knew I would actually succeed. They invested in the child who had potential. You were always going to be a failure anyway, so why would they waste good money on your useless degree? I turned to look at my sister in her glittering white gown. I was forced into a corner, Brittany. I took out predatory loans with massive interest rates just to survive my early 20s. I ate cheap noodles for 3 years and worked until my hands shook so I could afford to keep a roof over my head. You stole my foundation to buy a toy. Susan pointed a trembling finger at my face. How dare you speak to us this way? We gave you a roof over your head. We clothed you. We fed you. We are the only reason you are not living on the streets right now. Your father is paying for your classes at this very moment, and you have the audacity to stand here and throw ancient history in our faces. You are an ungrateful, miserable girl. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline flood my veins. I wanted to scream the truth at her. I wanted to tell her that I had paid off those predatory loans years ago. I wanted to tell her that my business cleared millions. But before I could open my mouth to unleash the reality they so desperately avoided, the heavy frosted glass doors of our private viewing suite swung open. The sudden intrusion cut our argument dead. A woman swept into the room, bringing with her the overwhelming scent of expensive floral perfume and an air of absolute entitlement. It was Beverly Bradley's mother. She was a woman who clearly spent a fortune maintaining a youthful appearance, wrapped in a pristine cream-colored cashmere coat with a designer handbag hooked over her forearm. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, immediately scanned the room, assessing the value of everything and everyone in it. The tension in the suite completely transformed. The heavy, venomous atmosphere of our family fight evaporated, replaced instantly by a suffocating layer of desperate sycophancy. It was truly a marvel to witness my sister switch personas. The cruel, sneering tyrant who had just mocked my financial struggles disappeared in the blink of an eye. Brittany let out a delighted, airy gasp, pressing her hands to her cheeks, as if she had just been surprised by her favorite celebrity. She stepped down from the velvet pedestal, careful to lift the hem of her glittering custom gown, and glided across the marble floor. Her voice jumped an entire octave, landing in a breathless saccharine register that made my stomach turn. "Beverly, you made it," Brittany cooed, reaching out to grasp the older woman's hands. "I am so incredibly happy you are here. Your opinion means absolutely everything to me. I simply could not make a final decision on the veil without your perfect taste." My mother was right behind her, smoothing her own silk dress and offering a fawning smile that looked physically painful to maintain. Beverly offered a tight, practiced smile, accepting their worship as if it were her birthright. She patted Brittany's hands and stepped further into the suite. Her sharp gaze swept past the champagne trays and the racks of white silk, until it landed squarely on me. I was still standing there, encased in the hideous, ill-fitting olive green bridesmaid dress with silver pins sticking out of the awkward ruffled shoulders. Beverly raised a perfectly arched eyebrow, her expression freezing into a mask of polite confusion. "And this must be the older sister," Beverly said, her tone making it sound like she was identifying a strange stain on a rug. Brittany did not miss a beat. She positioned herself next to her future mother-in-law, linking their arms together in a show of false intimacy. "Yes, this is Lauren Brittany," said her voice dripping with manufactured pity. "She is trying on the bridesmaid gown I selected for her. We are really trying our best to include her in the wedding festivities despite her circumstances." Beverly tilted her head, her curiosity piqued by the subtle bait. "Her circumstances?" she asked. My mother sighed heavily, stepping in to support the narrative. "Lauren has had a very difficult time finding her footing in the real world," Susan explained, shaking her head mournfully. She is currently unemployed and struggling to find any sort of ambition. She has always been a bit lost. We do what we can to keep her afloat, but it is an ongoing challenge for the family. Brittany placed a comforting hand on Beverly's arm and leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a loud, theatrical whisper that was clearly meant for me to hear. It is honestly heartbreaking. She dropped out of her business classes years ago and just never recovered. My parents are absolute saints. They pay for her tiny apartment and send her an allowance every single month just so she can survive. She spends most of her days sitting at home while my dad covers all her bills. We try to encourage her to get a simple retail job, or maybe do some basic administrative work, but she just lacks the drive. Beverly looked at me, her eyes traveling slowly from the bunching fabric at my waist up to the stiff, unflattering neckline. The polite confusion on her face morphed into blatant, unconcealed disgust. She unlinked her arm from Brittany and took a small step toward me, looking at me as if I were a charity case that had wandered in off the street. How deeply unfortunate, Beverly said, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet suite. You know, Lauren, in our family, we believe that idle hands are the devil's playground. Bradley works tirelessly to maintain our corporate logistics empire. It requires a proper work ethic, something you clearly have not developed. You cannot expect to live off your parents' charity forever. At 33, it is frankly embarrassing to be a dependent. You should take a page from your sister's book. She understands the value of building a successful life and associating with the right kind of people. I stood completely still. My jaw ached from how hard I was clenching my teeth. I looked at Beverly, then at my mother, and finally at Brittany, who was watching me with a look of pure triumphant malice. She was daring me to speak. She wanted me to explode. She wanted me to scream and shout and defend myself because she knew exactly what would happen if I did. If I raised my voice, if I told them about my multi-million-dollar agency or my executive degree, they would just shake their heads and act like I was having a mental breakdown. They would look at Beverly with sympathetic eyes and whisper about my delusions. Any outburst from me right now would only validate their vicious lies and cement my role as the unstable, jealous sister. They had backed me into a corner where the truth sounded like a desperate fantasy and silence felt like an admission of guilt. The injustice of it burned in my chest. I wanted to rip the pins out of this horrific green dress, throw it on the marble floor, and walk out. I wanted to hand Beverly my business card and watch the color drain from her arrogant face. But I forced myself to breathe. I forced the hot rising anger down into my stomach. A good mergers and acquisitions consultant never reveals their leverage until the contract is on the table. Revealing my success in a bridal boutique to a woman who thought she was untouchable would be a waste of a perfectly good weapon. I needed to let them build their house of cards as high as possible before I kicked out the foundation, so I bit my tongue. I lowered my gaze, pretending to be properly chastised by Beverly's condescending lecture. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly, feeding into their manufactured image of my defeat. You are right, Beverly, I said, forcing my voice to sound meek and subdued. I appreciate your advice. I will try to be more mindful of my future. Brittany beamed, her eyes sparkling with malicious victory. Susan let out a soft breath of relief. Good, Beverly replied, adjusting her designer handbag over her wrist. Acceptance is the very first step toward self-improvement. Now, Brittany, darling, let us look at those custom veils. I hear you are considering imported French lace. The three women turned their backs on me, completely dismissing my existence as they fluttered over toward a display of long, shimmering veils. I remained totally silent, letting them enjoy their fleeting victory. Their arrogance was blinding them. I stood in that suffocating fitting room for another grueling 45 minutes. Susan and Beverly dominated the space, completely ignoring my physical discomfort as the seamstress tightened the olive green fabric around my ribs until I could barely draw a full breath. Brittany paraded in front of the mirrors, demanding endless adjustments to her crystal-covered train and asking Beverly for her opinion on every minor detail. Every few minutes, one of them would shoot a pointed glance in my direction, usually followed by a thinly veiled comment, about how difficult it is to dress a body that lacks discipline, or how sad it must be to have nowhere important to be. I swallowed every insult. I kept my face carefully blank, offering polite nods whenever I was addressed directly. I let the seamstress poke and prod without complaint. My silence was a shield they mistook for surrender. When the fitting finally ended, I was allowed to retreat into the small changing stall to remove the horrible bridesmaid dress. Taking it off felt like shedding a physical manifestation of my family's toxic expectations. I slipped back into my tailored charcoal blazer and dark slacks, feeling my posture naturally straighten the moment the cheap synthetic fabric was gone. I folded the green dress neatly and handed it to the attendant. Stepping back into the main viewing suite, I found the three women sipping fresh glasses of champagne and discussing the catering menu for the rehearsal dinner. I cleared my throat to announce my departure. "I have to go now," I said, keeping my voice soft and unassuming. "Thank you for including me in the fitting." Susan waved a hand without even looking up from the catering brochure. "Yes, fine," she said dismissively. "Try to be on time for the rehearsal, Lauren, and please do something about your hair before then." Beverly offered a tight little nod, her eyes completely devoid of warmth. "Goodbye, Lauren," she said, her tone suggesting she hoped it would be a very long time before our paths crossed again. Brittany just smiled, sipping her champagne, and gave me a little mock wave. I walked out of the viewing suite down the long marble hallway of the boutique and pushed through the heavy frosted glass doors. The moment the crisp afternoon air hit my face, I let out a long, slow exhale. The physical relief of being out of that building was immediate. My shoulders dropped their defensive tension, and I allowed myself to take a deep, grounding breath. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the downtown skyline, casting long shadows across the luxury cars parked along the street. I walked toward my reliable older sedan, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion washing over me. The emotional toll of pretending to be the failure they wanted me to be was draining, but I knew the facade was necessary. I reached my car, unlocked the door, and tossed my purse onto the passenger seat. Before I could even put the key in the ignition, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my cup holder. The bright screen illuminated the dim interior of the car, displaying the name of my business partner. It was Evan. He knew I was at a family event today, and we had a strict rule about not interrupting each other during family obligations unless it was an absolute emergency or incredibly good news. Given that it was a Tuesday afternoon, I assumed it was the latter. I picked up the phone and accepted the call, leaning my head back against the headrest. "Tell me you have good news, Evan," I said, letting out a tired sigh. Because I just spent 2 hours being treated like a peasant by a woman who wears too much Chanel perfume. Evan let out a loud, triumphant laugh on the other end of the line. His energy was crackling so intensely, I could practically feel it through the speaker. "Oh, I have good news, Lauren," he said, his voice practically buzzing with excitement. "I have the best news we have ever had since we opened the firm. I need you to sit down for this." "I am already sitting in my car," I replied, a genuine smile finally breaking through the heavy mood of the afternoon. "What happened? Did the tech merger finally close?" "Better than that," he said. "You know that massive blind audit we put a bid on last month? The one for the anonymous megacorporation looking to absorb a major logistics network. The one we thought was a long shot, because we are a boutique agency competing against the massive global firms." My heart skipped a beat. The blind audit was the holy grail of our quarter. We had spent weeks putting together a flawless proposal, but the client had kept the target company completely anonymous during the bidding process, requiring extensive non-disclosure agreements just to participate. It was a multi-million-dollar contract that would elevate our firm from a highly successful boutique to a major industry player overnight. "Are you telling me we got it?" I asked, gripping the steering wheel tight. "Evan, did we actually get the contract?" "We got the contract, Lauren," he practically shouted. "The lead counsel for the acquiring corporation just called me 10 minutes ago. They loved our aggressive approach to asset verification. They said our firm has exactly the kind of ruthless, analytical reputation they need for this acquisition. They are emailing over the official retainer agreement right now, and the initial data dump of the target company's financial records will be arriving on our secure servers by midnight tonight. I let out a breathless laugh, feeling a massive rush of adrenaline completely wipe away the fatigue of the bridal boutique. "This is incredible, Evan," I said, my mind already racing with the logistical planning we would need to do. "This changes everything for us. We need to clear the schedule for the next 3 weeks. I will head back to the office right now so we can start building the audit framework. Who is the target company? Did they finally unmask the logistics network we are auditing?" "Yes, they did," Evan said, and his tone shifted slightly, dropping some of the wild excitement for a more serious professional edge. "That is actually why I called you immediately. You might need to recuse yourself from the ground level of this specific audit, Lauren. Or at the very least, we need to have a very serious conversation about conflict of interest protocols before we sign the retainer." I frowned, confused by his sudden caution. "Conflict of interest," I repeated. "Evan, what are you talking about? I do not have any personal investments in the logistics sector. Who is the target company?" Evan paused for a long second, allowing the weight of the moment to settle between us. "The target company is Vance Global Logistics," he said quietly. The air in my car vanished. My lungs stopped working. The ambient noise of the city traffic outside my windows faded into a dull, distant ringing. I sat frozen, staring blankly through my windshield at the brick wall of the bridal boutique across the street. "Lauren," Evan asked, his voice filled with concern. "Are you there? I know that is your future brother-in-law's family company. The acquiring megacorporation is planning to buy them out completely, but they want us to tear through their financial disclosures first to make sure their valuation is accurate. I know your sister is marrying into that family in a few weeks. If this is going to cause a problem for you personally, we can pass the contract to another firm." I did not answer him immediately. My mind was reeling, flashing back to the events that had just unfolded 10 minutes ago. I saw Beverly's sneering face telling me I lacked a proper work ethic. I saw my mother's smug satisfaction as she mocked my supposed unemployment. I saw Brittany's malicious joy as she paraded her proximity to the elite untouchable logistics empire. They had built their entire superiority complex on the foundation of Bradley and Beverly's flawless corporate wealth. They had humiliated me, degraded me, and threatened my livelihood based on the assumption that they were aligning themselves with untouchable financial power. And now that very same power was sitting in a data dump waiting to be delivered to my secure servers. The empire they worshipped was about to be laid bare on my desk. Every bank account, every offshore asset, every tax filing, and every corporate secret belonging to Beverly's precious family was about to be subjected to my firm's ruthless, unyielding scrutiny. They thought I was a pathetic dependent holding the coats while they shined. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the keys to their entire kingdom. "Lauren," Evans said again, his voice pulling me back to reality. "Talk to me. Do we need to decline this contract?" I slowly took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. I looked at the frosted glass doors of the bridal boutique, where my family was currently toasting to their fraudulent superiority. "No, Evan," I said, my voice completely steady and cold as ice. "We are not declining the contract. Accept the terms immediately. I will be at the office in 20 minutes. Let us see exactly what this elite family is hiding." The drive downtown took exactly 18 minutes. I pulled my reliable older sedan into the subterranean parking garage of my office building, the tires squealing slightly against the polished concrete as I navigated the tight turns. The elevator ride up to the 42nd floor always felt like a physical transition between two entirely different lives. When the heavy stainless steel doors slid open with a soft chime, I stepped out of the shadow of my manipulative family and walked directly into the reality of my own creation. The reception area of my firm was a sprawling expanse of minimalist glass, dark mahogany wood, and brushed steel. The panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the city's skyline as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the skyscrapers. This was my domain. There were no hideous olive green dresses here, There were no condescending whispers, fake smiles, or demands for unearned loyalty. There was only data strategy and absolute power. I walked past the empty reception desk, the heels of my practical shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and headed straight for the secure conference room at the back of our office suite. Evan was already there waiting for me. He had his suit jacket off and his dress shirt sleeves rolled up past his elbows, revealing the faint exhaustion of a long day that had suddenly turned into an all-nighter. 4 massive curved monitors were illuminated on the large conference table, casting a harsh, clinical white glow across his focused face. He looked up as I entered the room and wordlessly pushed a steaming cup of black coffee across the polished wood table toward my usual seat. I dropped my purse onto a leather chair, took off my blazer, and took my place beside him. The transition was instantaneous. The abused, quiet daughter vanished the moment my fingers touched the keyboard. I became the ruthless executive they paid millions of dollars for. "The data dump just finished compiling on our end," Evan said, tapping a silver pen against his chin as he scrolled through a seemingly endless directory of files. Vance Global Logistics gave our client full access to their internal servers under the strict non-disclosure agreements. We are looking at 10 years of asset disclosures, corporate tax filings, subsidiary accounts, international payroll records, and offshore holdings. It is an absolutely massive file size. It will take an army of junior analysts weeks to comb through this manually. We are not using junior analysts for this sweep. I ordered, my voice sharp and entirely focused on the glowing screens in front of me. I want to look at their primary operating accounts first. Pull up their cash flow statements for the last 8 quarters. Then we will cross-reference those numbers directly with their reported liabilities and capital expenditures. Evan clicked his mouse and the screens instantly filled with endless rows of spreadsheets, dense financial jargon, and complex banking codes. To anyone else walking off the street, it would look like an overwhelming headache-inducing wall of incomprehensible text. To me, it was a language I spoke fluently. This was the exact analytical skill my father had mocked my entire life. He had spent my childhood and my early 20s telling me I lacked the raw intelligence for the business world, that I was meant for menial administrative tasks, that my brain was simply not wired for high-level corporate strategy. Yet here I was sitting in my own firm, dissecting the foundational wealth of the very family he currently worshipped like royalty. We started with the surface-level documents to establish a baseline. Vance Global Logistics projected a flawless public image of absolute dominance in the international supply chain sector. Their public relations team had spent decades cultivating a narrative of untouchable old money success. They boasted in press releases about massive global shipping fleets, state-of-the-art automated warehouses, and highly efficient international distribution hubs. The acquiring megacorporation was offering top market dollar for this merger because they fundamentally believed they were purchasing a thriving, well-oiled machine that would instantly expand their global footprint. My job was to verify that the machine actually worked and was not just a prop. For the first 3 hours of our audit, the numbers seemed relatively normal. The revenue streams matched their public filings. The operational costs were high, but completely standard for an international logistics network dealing with fluctuating fuel prices and global shipping tariffs. Evan and I worked in a companionable, intense silence, the only sounds in the secure room being the rapid clicking of our computer mice and the occasional scratch of a pen on a legal pad. But as we dug deeper into the dense layers of their asset disclosures, my professional instincts began to tingle. Something felt slightly off in the math. It was a very subtle inconsistency, a tiny misalignment in the way their accountants were structuring their quarterly reporting to the board. "Pull up their depreciation schedules for their international shipping fleets," I said, leaning much closer to my monitor and narrowing my eyes at a specific column of numbers. "Look at the valuation they are claiming on these cargo ships right here in the 3rd quarter. Evan quickly brought the requested files up on his main screen. He squinted at the numbers, his brow furrowing, and then he frowned deeply. "They are overvaluing their fleet by a massive margin. They are claiming these specific cargo ships are worth top-tier market value, but according to their own internal maintenance logs from the engineering department, half of these vessels are over 20 years old. They should have depreciated significantly by now. They are reporting scrap metal as premium assets. It is not just the shipping fleet, I murmured, my eyes rapidly scanning the corresponding corporate tax filings from the previous year. Look at their warehouse properties across Europe and Asia. They are claiming full ownership on their balance sheets to inflate their corporate net worth, but the local property tax records tell a completely different story. They are holding these properties through a highly complex web of subsidiary limited liability companies based in overseas tax havens. I began pulling apart the corporate structure piece by piece, tracing the hidden threads of their holding companies through a maze of international corporate law. The deeper I went into the files, the more convoluted and desperate the web became. Vance Global Logistics had created dozens of shell companies designed specifically to obscure the true nature of their financial health from public investors and potential buyers. It was a classic, desperate misdirection tactic used by failing corporations trying to hide major liabilities from the market. My father had always told me I was blind to how the real world operated, but sitting in this secure room, I could see everything with perfect, devastating clarity. I could see every lie, every hidden transaction, every desperate attempt to maintain a crumbling facade of elite wealth. They are moving money rapidly between these subsidiaries to artificially inflate their quarterly earnings. I explained to Evan, highlighting a series of massive wire transfers on my screen. When the main corporate operating account runs low, they take out a high-interest loan through one of these offshore holding companies and immediately funnel the cash back into the primary account, labeling it as revenue. It looks like legitimate profit on the surface to a casual observer, but it is actually just recycled toxic debt. Evan let out a low, disbelieving whistle and ran a hand over his face. That is highly unethical accounting, Lauren. It borders on outright corporate fraud. But why would a massive logistics empire need to recycle debt just to show a profit margin? They have active contracts with some of the biggest commercial retailers in the world. They should be swimming in legitimate, verifiable cash. That is exactly what we are going to find out right now, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard with renewed intensity. Let us look at their debt obligations. I want to see every single commercial loan, every revolving line of credit, and every leveraged asset they currently have on the books. Leave no stone unturned. The night stretched on around us. We ordered cheap takeout and ate it at our desks, while scrolling through thousands of pages of redacted financial history. The emotional fatigue of the day melted away entirely, replaced by the thrilling cold pursuit of the truth. I systematically dismantled the Vance family empire hour by hour, stripping away the glamorous public image to reveal the raw, unvarnished, ugly data beneath. I thought about Beverly in her pristine cashmere coat, standing in that upscale boutique and lecturing me about a proper work ethic. I thought about Brittany bragging about marrying into elite, untouchable wealth. I used the memory of their staggering arrogance as fuel, pouring all my intense focus into uncovering the reality they were so immensely proud of. As dawn approached, the city skyline outside our conference room window began to glow with the soft pink and orange light of morning. The coffee in my cup had long since gone cold and bitter, but I was wide awake. The scattered puzzle pieces were finally snapping together, forming a financial picture so catastrophic that I almost could not believe my own eyes. I sat back heavily in my leather chair and stared at the final comprehensive spreadsheet we had compiled. The silence in the room was incredibly heavy, loaded with the immense weight of the massive secret we had just uncovered. Evan, I said softly, my voice barely more than a whisper in the quiet room. Look at the debt-to-equity ratio on their commercial real estate holdings and their international shipping hubs. Evan rolled his chair over to my side of the long table and stared at my monitor. He was completely silent for a long time as his brain absorbed the terrifying numbers presented on the screen. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with shock and disbelief. They leveraged everything, every single warehouse, every corporate office building, every piece of land they own. They took out massive commercial loans against their own vital infrastructure. It gets so much worse, I told him, bringing up another heavily encrypted file we had cracked. Look at their operational cash flow over the last 12 months. The interest rates on those massive commercial loans are adjustable. When the global market shifted last year, their debt servicing costs skyrocketed overnight. They are paying millions of dollars every single month just in interest alone. Their legitimate revenue from their shipping contracts does not even cover the bare minimum interest payments anymore. They are bleeding cash daily. We cross-referenced the internal bank statements with their outstanding credit lines from major financial institutions. The truth was absolutely undeniable, and it was devastatingly complete. Vance Global Logistics was not an untouchable corporate empire. It was a hollow, rotting shell, propped up entirely by a terrifying mountain of hidden debt. For the past 3 years, Bradley's family had been severely hemorrhaging money. They had been desperately borrowing from one predatory lender to pay off another, hopelessly trapped in a vicious cycle of highly leveraged assets and crushing interest rates. They had literally mortgaged their entire future just to keep the lights on in their offices and maintain their luxurious elite public lifestyle. "They are completely broke," Evan said, rubbing his tired eyes. "Lauren, they are functionally insolvent. If the banks realize what is happening and call in these commercial loans today, the entire company folds instantly. They do not have the liquidity to survive another financial quarter. They are a ghost company. They are on the verge of total bankruptcy." I confirmed, feeling a strange, intoxicating mix of professional shock and profound personal validation. The business is drowning. The luxury sports cars, the European estates, the private corporate jets, the diamond engagement rings, it is all financed by massive debt they can never repay. Their elite wealth is nothing but a carefully maintained illusion. Suddenly, the highly publicized mega merger made perfect logical sense. It was not a strategic business expansion or a triumphant consolidation of industry power like the press releases claimed. It was a desperate last-ditch bailout. Bradley's father had managed to convince the acquiring megacorporation that Vance Global Logistics was a highly profitable, lucrative acquisition. If the merger successfully went through, the acquiring company would unknowingly absorb all of the hidden toxic debt, and Bradley's family would walk away with hundreds of millions in clean cash and stock options. They would successfully save their personal wealth and their elite social status right before the banks seized everything they owned. They were trying to cash out and run before the massive house of cards collapsed on top of them. "This merger is a massive scam," Evan muttered, shaking his head in disgust. "They are trying to offload billions in toxic, unpayable debt onto our client. If our client signs this acquisition agreement without knowing the true horrific financial state of Vance Logistics, it will completely tank their stock overnight. It could destroy our client entirely." "And that is exactly why they hired our firm," I replied, my eyes locked on the damning financial reports that prove the fraud. "They hired us to find the hidden liabilities because we are the best at what we do. And we just found the biggest liability of all." I leaned back in my chair, letting the sheer magnitude of the discovery wash over me. The elite, untouchable family that my parents worshipped like deities was a complete and utter fraud. Beverly had stood in that bridal boutique looking down her nose at me, lecturing me about living off charity and lacking ambition, while her own family was secretly drowning in absolute financial ruin. She was aggressively projecting an image of superiority while desperately trying to avoid complete social and financial destruction. Bradley, the golden fiancé, my sister bragged about constantly, was not the wealthy heir to an unstoppable empire. He was the heir to a rapidly sinking ship. My father had threatened to cut off my tuition and cast me out of the family because he genuinely believed Brittany was securing our social standing by marrying into unparalleled wealth. He was entirely willing to sacrifice his own daughter on the altar of Bradley's fake prosperity. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. My family had spent my entire life tearing me down, calling me a failure, and telling me I would never amount to anything of value. Now they were blindly tying themselves to a family that was completely bankrupt, and I was the only person on earth standing between that family and absolute ruin. I thought about the damp $20,000 invoice my father had thrown at me during our brunch. I thought about the hideous, scratchy olive green dress and the cruel, mocking laughter in the bridal suite. They had pushed me into a corner, fully expecting me to cower and beg for their mercy. They thought they held all the power because they believed the illusion of wealth was real. They had absolutely no idea that the quiet, supposedly struggling sister was currently sitting in a downtown high-rise, holding the detonator to their entire social existence in the palm of her hand. "We have to draft the preliminary audit report immediately," Evan said, his professional drive overriding his exhaustion as he pulled up a blank document on his screen. "Our client needs to know that this target company is completely radioactive. We have to kill this merger before they sign the binding agreements next week." "We will," I said calmly, my voice steady and resolute. "We will document every hidden loan, every fraudulent valuation, and every leveraged asset. We will build an airtight, indisputable case that proves Vance Global Logistics is totally insolvent." I looked out the window at the city waking up below us. The morning sky was bright, crisp, and clear. My family was probably waking up in their large suburban home, feeling incredibly smug and satisfied with how they had treated me the day before. They truly thought they had won. They thought I was finally broken and defeated. I took a slow sip of cold coffee and turned my attention back to the glowing monitors. The corporate audit was only the beginning. The real reckoning was just over the horizon. I turned my attention away from the window and stared back at the glaring white screens filling the dark conference room. We had already uncovered the massive mountain of corporate debt threatening to crush Vance Global Logistics, but my instincts told me we were not finished. When a company is bleeding cash at this unprecedented rate, the executives at the top usually leave a secondary trail of desperate decisions. I told Evan to pull up the personal financial disclosures and executive expense accounts for the board of directors. I specifically wanted to look at Bradley and his immediate family. Evan rubbed his temples and clicked through the secure directory, opening a new batch of encrypted folders. The files contained years of personal credit card statements, discretionary corporate funds, and private banking records for the entire executive team. We started meticulously filtering the data. We were looking for abnormal withdrawal patterns or unauthorized personal loans taken against the crumbling corporate assets. For the first hour, the expenses looked typical for a family desperately trying to project elite wealth. There were exorbitant charges for luxury car leases, private club memberships, and massive restaurant tabs. It was all a desperate attempt to maintain their untouchable social facade, while the business silently burned to the ground behind closed doors. But as I scrolled through Bradley's personal corporate expense account, a specific series of wire transfers caught my eye. The transactions were completely out of place compared to his usual spending habits. I stopped scrolling and leaned closer to my monitor. I noticed a cluster of massive outbound wire transfers beginning roughly 6 months ago, right around the time Bradley and Brittany announced their engagement. There were identical wire transfers being authorized every 2 weeks. $50,000 here, $75,000 there. They were all categorized under incredibly vague administrative labels like wedding logistics consulting or independent vendor retainers. The sheer volume of cash being moved was staggering. In the span of 6 months, Bradley had authorized over $600,000 in direct wire transfers from the corporate accounts to a series of unlisted vendors. I pointed to the screen and told Evan to trace the routing numbers for the outbound transfers. I wanted to see exactly where Bradley was funneling his rapidly dwindling corporate funds. Evan typed rapidly, running the bank routing numbers through our secure financial database to identify the receiving institutions. The transfers were not going to established wedding planners or high-end florists or luxury caterers. Every single wire transfer was being routed into a newly formed limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. The company was named Blue Diamond Event Management. It had no corporate website, no commercial address, and absolutely no history of operating within the luxury event industry. I felt a sharp thrill of investigative adrenaline. This was a classic embezzlement structure. Someone was using a dummy corporation to quietly siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the dying logistics empire. I asked Evan to pull the public registration records for Blue Diamond Event Management. We needed to find the registered agent who had filed the paperwork to open the offshore bank accounts. Evan accessed the state registry and pulled up the incorporation documents. The digital file loaded on his screen displaying the scanned signature and the personal contact information of the registered agent who owned the dummy corporation. I stared at the name on the screen and my breath caught in my throat. I actually had to blink several times to make sure my exhausted eyes were not deceiving me. The registered agent listed on the incorporation documents was Brittany. My sister was the sole owner of Blue Diamond Event Management. The routing numbers for the massive corporate wire transfers led directly into Brittany's personal private banking accounts. A loud burst of genuine shocked laughter escaped my lips, echoing sharply in the quiet conference room. Evan turned to look at me with wide eyes, completely baffled by my sudden reaction. I pointed a trembling finger at the name on the screen and explained the entire situation to him. I laid out the brilliant, terrifyingly stupid reality of what we were looking at. Bradley and Brittany were actively mutually scamming each other in real time. My father, Richard, had spent the last 2 years carefully feeding Bradley an intricate web of lies. Richard had convinced Bradley and his snobbish mother, Beverly, that our family possessed an immense amount of generational wealth. Richard had successfully projected the illusion that Brittany was an elite high society heiress with an endless trust fund. Bradley, believing he had found a wealthy bride who could help salvage his crumbling social status, had proposed to her. Bradley wanted access to our fake family wealth to save his dying company. But Brittany was not wealthy. Brittany was entirely reliant on the small allowance my parents gave her. She had absolutely no money of her own to fund the extravagant millionaire lifestyle she desperately wanted to project. So when Bradley gave her access to his corporate expense accounts to help plan their luxury wedding, Brittany saw an opportunity. She created a fake vendor company and began aggressively invoicing her own fiancé for non-existent wedding services. Bradley, who was too desperate to secure the marriage and too distracted by his own impending bankruptcy, blindly approved every single fraudulent wire transfer. He thought he was spending corporate money to keep his incredibly wealthy bride happy. He had no idea he was actually funding her entire existence. Brittany was systematically draining the last remaining drops of fraudulent credit from Bradley's dying company. She was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars in toxic, unpayable debt and funneling it directly into her own pockets to buy designer clothes and fund luxury vacations. She thought she was brilliantly robbing an untouchable billionaire. Bradley thought he was securing a multimillionaire heiress. In reality, they were two completely broke, desperate people clinging to a sinking ship and stealing the life rafts from each other. The sheer poetic justice of the situation was overwhelming. My family had spent the entire morning mocking me for driving an older car and living in a modest apartment. They had called me a struggling failure. Meanwhile, my golden sister was actively committing corporate embezzlement and wire fraud just to afford the designer shoes she wore to insult me. She was tying herself legally and financially to a family that was about to be federally investigated for massive corporate debt restructuring fraud. I sat back in my leather chair, shaking my head in sheer amazement at the absolute arrogance and stupidity of my family. They had built their entire superiority complex on a foundation of mutual grift. They were parading around the city looking down on working-class people while they were actively engaged in a massive criminal enterprise. If the federal authorities caught wind of these wire transfers, Brittany would not just be embarrassed. She would be facing serious federal prison time for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. And my father, who had proudly orchestrated the initial lies, would be dragged right into the center of the investigative crossfire. Evan stared at the screen, running a hand through his hair in disbelief. He looked at me and asked if we needed to report this specific finding to our client. I nodded immediately. My voice was completely steady and resolute. We are obligated by our professional retainer to report all financial anomalies discovered during the due diligence period, I told him. We will document every single fraudulent wire transfer. We will attach the incorporation documents proving Brittany is the registered agent. We will package it all together and present it directly to the acquiring megacorporation. Our client needs to know that the target company is not just bankrupt, but actively being drained by internal embezzlement. We spent the next 4 hours meticulously downloading, compiling, and encrypting the explosive evidence. We organized the bank statements, the wire transfer receipts, and the corporate tax filings into a comprehensive, undeniable digital portfolio. I reviewed every single page, ensuring the narrative was perfectly clear and absolutely devastating. There would be no room for excuses. There would be no way for Bradley to claim ignorance, and no way for Brittany to hide her theft. The undeniable math was written in black and white. As the morning sun fully illuminated our downtown office, the final pieces of the dossier fell into place. We had successfully built a weapon of mass financial destruction. The elite, untouchable empire my family worshipped had been completely dismantled and reduced to a digital file sitting on my desktop. I felt a deep, profound sense of calm settle over my mind. I was no longer the abused scapegoat daughter hiding in the background. I was the architect of their impending ruin. While Evan went to the break room to grab us fresh bottles of water, my personal cell phone sitting on the conference table suddenly lit up. The bright screen cut through the dim lighting of the room, displaying a new notification. It was a message in the family group chat. For the past few months, I had kept the chat muted entirely, ignoring the endless stream of photos featuring floral arrangements and catering menus. But today, the notification demanded my attention. I picked up the phone and unlocked the screen. Richard had sent a massive block of text to the group. It was not a conversation. It was a formal, aggressive declaration of punishment. I read the words, slowly digesting the sheer audacity of his message while sitting inches away from the evidence that would destroy his life. Richard began the message by announcing to the entire family that he was officially cutting off my tuition, effective immediately. He stated that he had already drafted an email to the university administration to withdraw all future financial support. He wanted to make sure everyone in the chat knew exactly how he was punishing me for my supposed disobedience. The message continued, detailing my failures. Richard wrote that my refusal to pay the $20,000 invoice for the bachelorette trip was a disgraceful display of selfishness. He then brought up my attitude at the dress fitting. He claimed that I had deliberately tried to embarrass the family in front of Beverly by acting sullen and disrespectful. He told the group that my lack of ambition and my terrible posture were a direct insult to the elite social standing they were trying to build. He wrote that he would no longer subsidize the life of a 33-year-old ungrateful dropout who contributed nothing to the family legacy. But cutting off my imaginary tuition was not enough for Richard. He needed to inflict public humiliation to truly assert his dominance. The final paragraph of his long message was dedicated entirely to the wedding reception seating chart. Richard announced that because of my complete lack of social grace and my refusal to be a team player, I was officially stripped of my position at the main bridal table. He stated that I was a visual liability and he could not risk having me sit anywhere near Bradley's wealthy and important relatives. Therefore, he wrote I was being relegated to the very back corner of the reception hall. He specifically mentioned that my new seat would be located at a small table situated directly next to the swinging kitchen doors, where the catering staff would be walking in and out all night. He wanted me hidden away in the darkest, most undesirable corner of the venue. He ended the message by telling me that I should consider myself incredibly lucky that he was not revoking my invitation entirely. He demanded that I show up, wear the dress Susan chose for me, and remain completely silent for the duration of the event. Immediately after Richard's massive text came through, Susan chimed into the chat. She sent a message expressing her full support for her husband's decision. She wrote that tough love was the only way I would ever learn respect, and that she hoped sitting by the kitchen doors would give me time to reflect on my terrible life choices. Brittany followed seconds later, sending a simple smiley face emoji, followed by a message saying it was for the best, since my cheap shoes would have ruined the aesthetic of the bridal table photos anyway. I sat alone in the quiet conference room, reading their toxic, vicious messages over and over again. I felt my heart beating at a slow, steady rhythm. In the past, a message like this would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and self-doubt. I would have cried. I would have wondered what was wrong with me. I would have scrambled to apologize just to restore the peace. But today, sitting in my sleek downtown office with the sunrise pouring through the windows, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, hard amusement. They were threatening to cut off tuition for a degree I already possessed. They were threatening to stop an allowance I never spent on myself. They were banishing me to the kitchen doors to protect the social standing of a family that was currently drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt and facing federal fraud investigations. They thought they were handing down a devastating punishment. They thought they had finally put the struggling failure in her proper place. They had no idea that they were speaking to the lead consultant, who was actively preparing the audit that would wipe out their entire existence. Evan walked back into the conference room holding 2 cold bottles of water. He stopped when he saw me looking at my phone. He set the bottles down on the table and asked if everything was all right. He knew my family could be difficult, and he looked genuinely concerned that they had managed to ruin the triumphant mood of our successful audit. I looked up from the screen and smiled at him. It was a genuine, bright smile. "Everything is perfectly fine, Evan," I told him. "My father just officially cut me off financially and moved my seat at the wedding reception to the back corner by the kitchen doors. He wants to make sure I do not embarrass the bride in front of her incredibly wealthy new in-laws." Evan let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head, as he looked at the massive stacks of financial ruin displayed on our encrypted monitors. He pointed to the spreadsheet showing Brittany's corporate embezzlement and raised an eyebrow. "I guess your family really values their elite social aesthetics," he joked. "It would be a real tragedy if a struggling student ruined the vibe of a federally investigated corporate fraud ring." I laughed softly and looked back down at the group chat. Susan and Brittany were currently discussing what kind of floral centerpieces would best obscure my face from the professional photographers. They were reveling in their cruelty, feeding off each other's toxic energy. They wanted a reaction from me. They wanted me to beg for my seat back or cry about the tuition money. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a fight. I was going to give them exactly enough rope to hang themselves completely. I tapped the text input box at the bottom of the screen. I did not write an angry paragraph defending myself. I did not mention my firm or my degree or my multi-million-dollar revenue. I simply stared at the monitors displaying the undeniable evidence of their impending financial and social doom. I thought about the moment I would hand this exact dossier to the acquiring mega-corporation board members. I typed a single-word response into the group chat and pressed send. Understood. I placed my phone face down on the conference table, turned back to my keyboard, and began drafting the final executive summary that would destroy them all. The next few days passed in a blur of intense preparation and absolute silence from my end. I finalized the audit report, locked the physical copies inside a sleek black leather briefcase, and secured the digital files on an encrypted drive. When Friday evening finally arrived, the air in the city felt heavy with anticipation. It was time for the rehearsal dinner. The event was being held at the Oak Ridge Country Club, a notoriously exclusive venue situated on the wealthiest edge of the city limits. The sprawling estate featured manicured golf courses, towering oak trees, and a massive clubhouse built from imported stone. It was the exact type of establishment my parents worshipped, a place where entry was dictated entirely by net worth and social connections. I pulled my reliable sedan up to the grand entrance and handed the keys to a valet who looked slightly confused by my vehicle amidst the sea of luxury sports cars. I did not care. My focus was entirely on the evening ahead. I stepped out of the car, and the cool evening breeze caught the fabric of my dress. I had not gone to a discount rack for tonight. I had visited my personal tailor and selected a custom piece that screamed stealth wealth to anyone who actually understood money. It was a floor-length gown in a deep, rich shade of midnight blue. The material was a heavy, flawless silk crepe that draped perfectly against my figure without clinging. There were no flashy logos, no excessive sequins, and no cheap tulle. It was a masterclass in understated elegance, featuring a high asymmetrical neckline and a sleek silhouette. The tailoring alone cost more than my father sent me in an entire year. I paired the gown with simple pointed toe heels and a pair of authentic diamond stud earrings I had purchased to celebrate my first $1 million quarter. In my right hand, I carried a slim black clutch, a subtle nod to the briefcase currently locked in the trunk of my car, holding the financial ruin of everyone inside the building. I walked up the sweeping stone steps and entered the grand foyer of the country club. The room was dripping in excessive floral arrangements and soft ambient lighting. Waitstaff circulated silently, with silver trays of expensive champagne. I spotted my family almost immediately. They were holding court near the entrance to the main dining hall, desperately trying to look like they belonged among Bradley's ultra-wealthy relatives. Susan was wearing a bright pink dress that was slightly too tight, and Brittany was draped in white lace, already playing the role of the blushing bride. Richard was laughing loudly at a joke made by Bradley's father holding a crystal glass of whiskey like it was a scepter. The moment I stepped fully into the light of the foyer, the entire dynamic shifted. A few of Bradley's relatives turned to look at me, their eyes sweeping over my gown with clear appreciation. They recognized the cut and the fabric. They recognized the quiet confidence of someone who did not need to shout to be seen. My mother happened to glance toward the entrance and her jaw literally dropped. She froze mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she took in my appearance. She tapped Brittany's arm frantically and pointed directly in my direction. Brittany spun around and the smug, arrogant smile vanished from her face instantly. She looked at my midnight blue gown, then down at my shoes and finally up to the diamond studs resting in my ears. Her face turned a mottled shade of angry red. I could see the exact moment her brain short-circuited. I was supposed to show up in something cheap and poorly fitting. I was supposed to look like the struggling dropout they had described to everyone. Instead, I looked like a chief executive officer arriving to close a hostile takeover. Before I could even take 5 steps into the room, Susan and Brittany broke away from Bradley's family and marched directly toward me. They moved with a frantic, aggressive energy, cutting me off before I could approach the main gathering. Susan grabbed my elbow and yanked me roughly into a secluded alcove near the coat check room, her fingernails digging sharply into my skin. Brittany followed close behind, her eyes burning with pure malice. "What on earth do you think you are doing, Lauren?" My mother hissed, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. Her eyes darted back and forth, making sure none of Bradley's relatives were watching us. "Who do you think you are showing up here looking like this?" I gently but firmly removed my arm from her grip, smoothing the silk of my sleeve. "I am attending the rehearsal dinner, Mom," I replied, my voice completely calm and level. "You told me it was a formal event. I dressed appropriately." Brittany scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest. "Oh, please," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "You expect us to believe you can actually afford a dress like that? I know exactly what you are doing. You went out and bought some fake designer trash from a knockoff website just to try and upstage me. Or worse, you plunged yourself into massive credit card debt just to buy a dress you are going to return tomorrow. You are absolutely pathetic, Lauren. You cannot even let me have one night without trying to pull focus with your cheap stunts." Susan nodded vigorously, pointing a rigid finger at my chest. "Your sister is entirely correct," she scolded me, her face pale with fury. "You are wearing a costume. You are trying to embarrass us by pretending to be something you are not. Everyone in that room knows you are a struggling student. Bradley's mother knows you do not have a real job. Showing up covered in fake luxury items only makes you look desperate and delusional. It highlights exactly why your father moved your seat to the back of the room for tomorrow. You have absolutely zero social grace." I stood there in the quiet alcove, letting their toxic accusations wash over me without reacting. I did not defend the quality of my gown. I did not mention the balance of my bank accounts. I simply looked at the 2 women who were so deeply insecure that the mere sight of high-quality silk caused them to spiral into a panic. They were projecting all of their own financial insecurities directly onto me. Brittany was literally funding her wedding through massive corporate fraud, yet she was accusing me of going into credit card debt for a dress. The hypocrisy was so staggering it almost felt scripted. I offered them a polite, icy smile. "If my attire distresses you so much, Brittany, I suggest you focus your attention back on your future in-laws," I said smoothly. "They are the ones you need to impress tonight, not me." I stepped around them, refusing to engage in their petty argument any further. I walked out of the alcove and headed directly toward the main dining hall. Susan and Brittany scrambled to follow me, muttering angry complaints under their breath, but they were forced to paste their fake smiles back onto their faces the moment we re-entered the public space. I found my assigned seat card near the back of the room, exactly where Richard had threatened to place me. I took my seat quietly, placing my small black clutch on the table in front of me. I sat with perfect posture, completely unbothered by their taunts. I knew exactly what was locked in the trunk of my car. I knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. I was simply waiting for the final act to begin. The rehearsal dinner proceeded with the kind of stiff, manufactured elegance that defined my family's entire existence. The waitstaff moved seamlessly through the room, pouring vintage wine and serving plates of seared filet mignon. The dining hall was packed with roughly 100 elite guests, mostly comprised of Bradley's extended family, wealthy business associates, and influential local politicians his parents had invited to showcase their supposed corporate dominance. I sat at a table filled with distant cousins and minor acquaintances, eating my meal in peaceful silence. I watched the room with the detached observation of a predator studying its prey. At the center of the room sat the massive head table, elevated slightly on a platform so everyone could gaze upon the happy couple. Bradley and Brittany sat side by side, holding hands and projecting an image of absolute romantic bliss. Richard and Susan sat to their left, practically glowing with self-importance. Bradley's parents, Beverly, and the CEO of Vance Global Logistics sat to their right, projecting the powerful old money aura they had spent decades cultivating. To the untrained eye, it was a gathering of untouchable American royalty. To my trained eye, it was a table full of bankrupt frauds and desperate embezzlers smiling through their teeth. As the main course was cleared away, and the dessert plates were set down, the sharp sound of a spoon clinking against a crystal glass echoed through the hall. The low hum of conversation faded into silence as everyone turned their attention toward the head table. Richard stood up holding a microphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other. He adjusted his expensive suit jacket and beamed out at the crowd of influential guests. He was in his element, holding the attention of powerful people ready to deliver a performance that would cement his status as the successful patriarch of an elite family. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Richard began, his voice booming through the sound system with practiced charisma. "We are gathered to celebrate the joining of two incredible families. When I look at Brittany and Bradley, I see the very best of what the future holds. I see ambition, grace, and an unbreakable commitment to excellence." The crowd murmured in polite agreement and clapped softly. Richard smiled down at Brittany, who dabbed at her dry eyes with a linen napkin. "My daughter Brittany has always been a shining light in our lives," he continued, his tone swelling with exaggerated emotion. "From the day she was born, she has pursued perfection. She is elegant, she is brilliant, and she carries the weight of our family legacy with unparalleled grace. And in Bradley, she has found a partner who matches her drive step for step. Together they are going to conquer the world. They are building a foundation of success that will last for generations to come." He paused to take a sip of his champagne, letting the applause wash over him. Then his eyes scanned the room, sweeping over the crowded tables, until his gaze locked directly onto me. He was standing on a stage surrounded by wealth, filled with the arrogant belief that he had completely broken my spirit. He could not resist the urge to assert his dominance one final time. He needed to prove to Beverly and the other elite guests that he was a strict, demanding father who did not tolerate failure, even in his own blood. Of course, raising children is a journey filled with different kinds of lessons. Richard said, his tone shifting from glowing pride to a patronizing, mocking drawl. "While Brittany has always sprinted toward success, we have learned that some paths take a little longer to navigate." He pointed his champagne glass directly at my table in the back of the room. The spotlight of the conversation slammed onto me. 100 wealthy guests turned in their seats to look at the woman in the midnight blue gown sitting quietly by herself. "I would like to offer a special toast tonight to my oldest daughter, Lauren," Richard announced, his voice dripping with condescension as a cruel, mocking smile spread across his face. "Lauren, who reminds all of us that it is never too late to find yourself, even if it takes a decade to finish a simple degree. Here is to the perpetual students among us, the ones who take their time figuring out the real world while the rest of us build it." May you eventually find your way out of the classroom. A heavy, uncomfortable silence hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the reaction hit. A ripple of low, mocking laughter rolled through the room, starting with Beverly and Bradley's relatives at the head table and spreading through the influential guests. It was the kind of polite, elitist laughter reserved for pitying someone entirely beneath their station. They were laughing at the struggling dropout. They were laughing at the failure who could not measure up to her perfect younger sister. Brittany covered her mouth to hide a massive, delighted grin. Susan looked down at her plate, shaking her head as if burdened by the immense tragedy of having me as a daughter. I did not break eye contact with my father. I did not flush red with embarrassment. I did not shrink down in my chair or look away in shame. I sat perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the table on either side of my small black clutch. I let a slow, icy, unbothered smile form on my face. I raised my own glass of sparkling water and tilted it toward him in a silent, mocking salute. I took a slow sip, completely unfazed by the 100 pairs of judging eyes fixed upon me. My father expected me to crumble. He expected tears. He expected me to flee the room in absolute humiliation, proving to everyone that I was exactly the weak, pathetic disappointment he claimed I was. When I simply sat there radiating cold, impenetrable confidence, his smug smile faltered for just a second. He quickly lowered his glass and turned his attention back to the bride and groom, wrapping up his speech with a hasty, concluding remark before handing the microphone over to Bradley's father. The conversation in the room slowly resumed its normal volume, but I could feel the lingering stares and hear the whispered comments from the tables around me. I did not care. Their laughter meant absolutely nothing to me. They were a room full of sheep cheering for a shepherd leading them straight off a cliff. My father had just stood on a stage and praised the integrity of a man whose company was actively drowning in toxic, unpayable debt. He had just celebrated the grace of a daughter who was currently committing massive federal wire fraud to fund the very dinner they were eating. I sat back in my chair and smoothed the flawless silk of my designer gown. The cruel public toast was the final nail in their coffin. Richard had drawn a clear, unmistakable line in the sand. He had publicly declared me a failure and severed any remaining microscopic shred of familial obligation I might have felt toward him. He had chosen his side. He had chosen the fake wealth, the fraudulent logistics empire, and the embezzling golden child. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, listening to the clinking glasses and the arrogant laughter of the elite guests. Tomorrow they would lose everything, and tomorrow they would realize that the struggling dropout they just mocked was the only person holding the executioner's blade. I did not look back to see his reaction, but I could feel the absolute terror radiating from him. The satisfying clink of my glass hitting the marble bar was the only punctuation that conversation needed. I glided through the room, navigating the clusters of wealthy guests with easy grace. When I reached the opposite side of the dining hall, I allowed myself a quick glance over my shoulder. Bradley was still frozen by the private bar. The arrogant swagger he had displayed just moments ago had completely evaporated. I watched as he fumbled frantically in his tailored tuxedo jacket for his cell phone. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the device on the floor. He pressed the phone to his ear and sprinted out a set of side patio doors, abandoning his rehearsal dinner to make an emergency phone call to his chief financial officer. My sister Brittany noticed his abrupt exit. She excused herself from a conversation and hurried toward the patio doors. She looked annoyed that her groom was not standing by her side playing the devoted billionaire fiancé. I watched her push through the doors to find him, but I already knew he would not be thinking about wedding aesthetics tonight. Bradley was going to spend the eve of his wedding desperately trying to figure out how a struggling dropout knew about his deeply buried fraud. The rehearsal dinner had served its purpose. I gathered my small black clutch and quietly exited the grand foyer, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of fake wealth and forced laughter behind me. The valet brought my older sedan around and I tipped him generously before sinking into the driver's seat. The drive back to my apartment was peaceful. The city streets were quiet, and the cool night air felt incredibly refreshing. I had laid the groundwork perfectly. The seed of panic had been planted. When I walked into my apartment, I picked up my laptop. Evan was still online. We had a brief, secure video call to review the timeline for the following day. Evan sat in his home office looking sharp and completely focused. He confirmed that the final physical copies of our audit report were printed bound and locked inside the secure briefcase. We went over the guest list for the VIP cocktail hour scheduled just before the wedding ceremony. The executives from the acquiring megacorporation were confirmed to attend. It was the perfect stage for an execution. "Get some sleep, Lauren," Evan told me, his voice steady. "Tomorrow is going to be the most chaotic day of your professional life. We hold all the cards. We just have to lay them on the table." I thanked him, ended the call, and went to my bedroom. I pulled out the dress I would wear to the wedding. It was not a bridesmaid gown. It was a stunning architectural sheath dress in a deep charcoal gray. It was the armor of a lead mergers and acquisitions consultant. I went to sleep. For the first time in weeks, I slept deeply and without a single dream. The morning of the wedding arrived with a bright sun. The venue was a sprawling historic estate located just outside the city limits. It featured rolling green lawns and a massive glass conservatory where the reception would be held. I parked near the vendor entrance, avoiding the main valet circle where the elite guests would soon be arriving. The estate was buzzing with frantic energy. Florists were rushing back and forth, carrying massive arrangements of white orchids. Catering staff shouted orders as they unloaded silver chafing dishes. I navigated the busy hallways and made my way to the bridal suite located in the west wing of the manor. I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into a room that looked like a tornado made of white tulle had touched down. Brittany was sitting in a velvet chair surrounded by makeup artists. She was screaming at a terrified assistant because her latte was the wrong temperature. Susan was pacing the floor, barking orders into her cell phone about seating arrangements. The room smelled overwhelmingly of expensive perfume and desperate anxiety. Neither of them noticed me right away, so I took a quiet spot near the bay window and simply watched the performance. My father, Richard, walked into the suite a few minutes later wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo. He poured a glass of champagne from a bottle resting on a silver tray and handed it to Susan. Then his eyes landed on me. His smile vanished, instantly replaced by a scowl. He walked over to my corner, looking me up and down. "I see you decided to show up," he muttered, his voice low so the stylists would not hear. "I am surprised you had the nerve after your little stunt wearing that ridiculous dress last night. I hope you remember our agreement. You will keep your mouth shut today. You will sit where you are told, and you will not do a single thing to draw attention away from your sister." I looked at him, noting the slight bead of sweat on his forehead. "I am just here to do my job, Dad," I replied, my voice completely smooth. "I am going to make sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve today." Richard snorted, dismissing my words entirely. "Just stay out of the way," he commanded, turning his back on me to join Susan near the mirrors. The clock on the wall ticked steadily closer to the ceremony time. Tension in the bridal suite escalated as minor details went wrong. The photographer was running 10 minutes late. Brittany was practically hyperventilating as the stylists pinned her intricate veil into place. I checked my phone. Evan had just texted to let me know he had arrived at the estate and was securing his visitor pass. The executives from the acquiring megacorporation were currently gathering in the private VIP lounge down the hall with Bradley's family. The trap was set and the players were taking their positions. Suddenly, Susan let out a sharp, frustrated gasp. She began digging frantically through her designer handbag, pulling out compacts and tossing them onto a nearby table. She looked up, her face pale with panic. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling. "I left the pearl necklace at home, the one Brittany was supposed to wear for the photographs. I left it on the kitchen counter." Brittany spun around in her chair. "You what?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Mom, you promised you had it. I need a necklace. The neckline of this dress looks completely empty without one. Bradley's mother is wearing diamonds and you forgot my pearls." Richard stepped in, trying to calm them down. "It is fine, we can send a driver back to the house to get it," he said. "We have time before the main photo session." "No, we do not." Brittany yelled, tears of absolute fury welling up in her eyes. "The traffic is terrible. A driver will take an hour. I am not walking out there looking like some cheap peasant. I need jewelry right now." The room fell into a tense, panicked silence. The stylists backed away, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire of the bridal meltdown. Susan looked around the room, desperately searching for a solution. Her eyes swept over the couches, the tables, and finally they landed directly on me. More specifically, her eyes locked onto the delicate vintage diamond necklace resting against my collarbone. It was the only piece of fine jewelry I owned left to me by my grandmother, before my parents could get it. Susan's eyes widened, and a look of absolute entitlement washed over her face. She took a step toward me, pointing a sharp, manicured finger at my chest. "Lauren," she demanded, her voice sharp and uncompromising, "take that necklace off right now. Your sister needs something borrowed for the ceremony, and that piece will do. Hand it over." I looked down at the delicate platinum chain resting against my collarbone. The vintage diamond pendant caught the bright fluorescent lighting of the bridal suite, throwing tiny fractals of light across the chaotic room. It was the only tangible thing I had left of my grandmother. She had given it to me privately just weeks before she passed away, explicitly stating that it was for me and me alone, because she knew exactly how my parents operated. She knew that if they found out about the heirloom, they would immediately confiscate it and hand it directly to Brittany. My grandmother had seen the blatant favoritism, and this necklace was her final quiet act of rebellion against the toxic dynamic my parents had built. Now Susan was standing inches away from my face, her hand outstretched with the palm facing up, demanding that I surrender the last piece of genuine familial love I possessed to appease her frantic, spoiled youngest daughter. I met my mother's demanding gaze with absolute stillness. "I am not taking this necklace off," I said, my voice maintaining a low, even volume that contrasted sharply with the hysterical energy vibrating through the suite. "This belongs to me. It is not a prop for Brittany's wedding aesthetic." Susan actually gasped, her hand dropping to her chest as if she had been physically struck. The sheer audacity of my refusal seemed to short-circuit her brain. She looked back at Brittany, who was currently clutching the heavy silk of her wedding gown, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. Brittany stomped her foot against the hardwood floor, a childish gesture that looked completely ridiculous, coming from a 30-year-old woman in a custom bridal gown. "You are ruining everything," Lauren, Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing painfully off the high ceilings. "I need something borrowed. The photographer is going to be here in less than 10 minutes to do the bridal portraits, and I cannot go out there looking incomplete. That necklace is perfect. It fits the vintage theme of my dress. Just take it off and give it to me. You can have it back tomorrow. It is not like you have anywhere important to wear it anyway." The sheer entitlement radiating from her was staggering. She truly believed that every single object in my possession was merely on loan to me until she decided she wanted it for herself. I shook my head slowly, keeping my hands resting loosely at my sides. "I am not giving it to you, Brittany," I repeated, ensuring my tone left absolutely no room for negotiation. "Grandmother left this specifically to me. It is the only heirloom I have, and it is not leaving my neck. You will have to find another accessory." My father had been standing near the refreshment table, pouring another glass of champagne. At my second refusal, he slammed the heavy crystal glass down onto the silver tray with enough force to shatter the stem. The sharp, violent sound caused the makeup artists and hairstylists to physically jump backward. They quickly gathered their expensive brushes and palettes, practically sprinting out of the bridal suite to escape the impending explosion. Within seconds, the room was completely emptied of event staff, leaving only the four of us locked in a suffocating bubble of familial rage. Richard marched across the room, his custom tuxedo shifting over his broad shoulders as he closed the distance between us. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. The vein pulsing near his temple indicated that he had completely lost whatever thin shred of patience he possessed. He stopped less than a foot away from me, using his height to try and physically intimidate me into submission. "You will do exactly as your mother told you." Richard commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that usually made his employees cower in fear. "You will unclip that necklace right now and you will hand it to your sister. You have spent this entire week acting like a petulant, ungrateful child. You refused to pay your fair share for the bachelorette trip. You humiliated us at the rehearsal dinner by parading around in a dress you clearly went into debt to buy. And now, minutes before the most important ceremony of your sister's life, you are choosing to be selfish over a piece of jewelry." I looked up into my father's angry, demanding eyes. I felt no fear. The intimidation tactics that had worked on me when I was a teenager were completely useless against the woman I had become. "You drained my entire college savings account to buy her a sports car," I reminded him, my voice completely steady. "You took away my financial security to buy her a toy. I think Brittany has taken enough from me in this lifetime. She is not taking my grandmother's necklace." Richard's face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. He raised his hand, pointing a thick finger directly between my eyes. "You ungrateful little wretch!" He spat the venom in his words, filling the quiet suite. "We put a roof over your head. We clothed you. We fed you. We gave you everything you needed to succeed, and you threw it all away to become a mediocre, struggling failure. You are a stain on this family. You contribute absolutely nothing of value to our name or our legacy." Susan stepped up beside him, nodding vigorously. "We are doing you a massive favor by even allowing you to stand in the same room as Bradley's family," she added, her voice shrill with panic. "They are elite corporate leaders, Lauren. They are billionaires. If you cannot do one simple thing to help your sister secure this marriage, then you have no place here. Give her the necklace." "No," I said. It was a single absolute word. Richard stared at me, his chest heaving with deep, angry breaths. He realized in that moment that he could not physically force me to remove the jewelry without causing a massive, violent scene that would undoubtedly ruin Brittany's perfect bridal hair and makeup. His physical intimidation had failed. His financial threats had failed. He was completely out of ammunition, and the realization drove him to the absolute edge of his sanity. "Fine!" Richard roared, his voice booming so loudly it seemed to shake the window panes of the historic manor. "If you will not act like a member of this family, then you are no longer part of it. You are stripped of your bridesmaid title entirely. I will not have you standing up there at the altar, looking like a sullen, jealous failure and ruining the aesthetic of my daughter's perfect day." He pointed a shaking finger toward the heavy oak door of the bridal suite. "Get out of my sight, Lauren!" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "Get out of this venue and do not ever come back. You are nothing to this family. You are cut off. You are a failure. Leave." I stood there for a long, quiet moment, letting his vicious, unforgiving words hang in the air between us. Brittany looked triumphant, a cruel smirk playing on her lips as she watched her father officially banish her biggest rival. Susan looked relieved, as if tossing me out was the easiest solution to all their problems. They truly believed they had won. They thought they had finally broken me, stripping me of my family title and casting me out into the cold. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I simply offered my father a slow, knowing smile. I turned on my heel, the heavy fabric of my designer dress sweeping elegantly across the floor, and I walked out of the bridal suite without looking back. The hallway outside the suite was a stark contrast to the screaming and chaos I had just left behind. It was lined with priceless antique portraits and thick woven carpets that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I walked slowly, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's toxic expectations lifted off my shoulders entirely. Richard had just officially severed our relationship. He had verbally and explicitly cut me off, revoking any lingering shred of familial obligation I might have subconsciously harbored. I was completely, beautifully free. However, I did not head toward the main exit of the historic estate. I had no intention of leaving the venue. I had a job to do. I pulled my phone from my small clutch and sent a single text message to Evan confirming that the detonation sequence was officially authorized. I turned down the grand vaulted corridor that led toward the east wing of the manor. This wing was heavily restricted, guarded by private security personnel hired specifically to keep the regular wedding guests away from the elite corporate power brokers. At the end of the corridor was the main VIP reception room. It was a stunning glass conservatory filled with exotic plants, plush velvet seating areas, and a private mahogany bar. This was where the highest-ranking executives from the acquiring mega corporation were currently having pre-wedding cocktails with Bradley's father and the logistics company board members. It was a private, insulated sanctuary designed for billionaires to discuss global market trends while sipping scotch that cost thousands of dollars a bottle. As I approached the entrance to the conservatory, two large security guards in dark suits immediately stepped forward to block my path. They held up their hands, their expressions stern and uncompromising. This area is restricted to VIP corporate guests, only the guard on the left stated firmly. Please return to the main guest holding area in the garden. I did not slow my pace. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the heavy embossed metal security credential that the acquiring megacorporation had issued to their lead auditors. I held the badge up so the guards could clearly see the corporate insignia and the holographic clearance seal. The guards' eyes widened as they recognized the highest level of corporate clearance available. They immediately dropped their hands and stepped backward, pulling open the heavy glass doors to allow me entry. I stepped into the VIP reception room. The atmosphere was incredibly hushed and powerful. The air smelled of expensive cigars, rare bourbon, and old money. There were roughly 20 men and women scattered throughout the conservatory, standing in small clusters, speaking in low, measured tones about international shipping tariffs and quarterly earnings. This was the absolute apex of elite corporate power. These were the people who could bankrupt a small country with a single signature. I bypassed the event staff carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and walked directly toward the center of the room. In the heart of the conservatory, bathed in the natural light pouring through the glass ceiling, stood a tight circle of the most powerful executives in the building. Bradley's father, the CEO of Vance Global Logistics, was standing there holding a crystal glass of whiskey. He was laughing warmly, completely surrounded by the senior board members of the acquiring mega corporation. I did not wait to be introduced. I did not wait for a break in the conversation. I stepped right into the center of the executive circle, placing myself directly in their line of sight. The conversation died instantly. The wealthy, powerful men stopped laughing and turned to look at the woman in the dark charcoal dress who had just brazenly interrupted their private gathering. Bradley's father stared at me, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He blinked several times, trying to place my face. I could see the exact moment the realization hit him. He recognized me from the rehearsal dinner the night before. He recognized me as the disgraced, struggling older sister of the bride, the pathetic dropout, who had been publicly mocked and humiliated by her own father in front of everyone. "Excuse me, Bradley's," father said, his voice dripping with aristocratic annoyance. He set his whiskey glass down on a nearby table and motioned for a security guard. "You are Richard's daughter, aren't you?" The sister. "I believe you are in the wrong room. This area is reserved strictly for corporate executives and board members. The main family holding area is back down the hall." I did not move a single inch. I held my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my gaze locked directly onto his arrogant face. "I am in exactly the right room," I replied, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the sudden silence of the conservatory. "I am not here as a member of the bridal party. I am here on official corporate business." The senior board members of the acquiring megacorporation exchanged confused glances. They looked at my confident stance, the high-quality cut of my designer dress, and the absolute lack of intimidation in my eyes. Bradley's father let out a short, dismissive scoff, clearly believing I was having some sort of mental breakdown, brought on by my family's public rejection. "I am not going to ask you twice to leave," Bradley's father warned, taking a step toward me in an attempt to use his physical presence to intimidate me exactly the way my father had tried just 10 minutes prior. "I do not know what kind of stunt you think you are pulling, but we are conducting serious business here. Security will escort you out." Before the guards could even take a step in my direction, the heavy glass doors of the conservatory swung open again. The sound of confident heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Evan walked into the room impeccably dressed in a sharp black suit. In his right hand, he carried a pristine locked brushed steel audit portfolio. The corporate seal of our mergers and acquisitions firm was engraved clearly on the front of the case. Evan completely ignored Bradley's father and the confused security staff. He walked straight through the executive circle, stopping directly at my side. He held the locked portfolio out to me with absolute professional deference. I took the heavy steel case from his hands, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the financial ruin locked inside. I turned my attention back to Bradley's father, whose face had suddenly gone incredibly slack as he recognized the corporate insignia on the portfolio. The smug, elite arrogance melted away entirely, replaced by a sudden creeping sense of absolute dread. I smiled, letting the silence stretch for just a moment longer, preparing to introduce them to the real me. "Gentlemen," I said, projecting my voice to command the entire space. "My name is Lauren. I am the lead consultant and managing partner of the mergers and acquisitions firm you hired to conduct the comprehensive financial evaluation of this proposed buyout. I am the executive who holds the final authority on the financial viability of Vance Global Logistics." The reaction was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. Jonathan, the chief executive officer of the acquiring megacorporation, stepped out from the tight circle of men. He was a tall, imposing figure with silver hair and a sharp, tailored suit. He looked at the brushed steel portfolio resting in my hands and then looked directly into my eyes. He did not see a disgraced sister or a struggling student. He saw the financial mercenary his board of directors had paid an exorbitant retainer to protect their corporate interests. "Lauren," he said, his voice echoing with genuine respect and mild surprise, "we were told you were running the field team on this data sweep. We expected your preliminary findings to be delivered to our corporate offices on Monday morning. We certainly did not expect you to deliver the executive summary in person at a social event." Bradley's father, Charles, stared at Jonathan in absolute bewilderment. He gripped his crystal whiskey glass so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. "Jonathan, what is the meaning of this?" Charles demanded, his voice wavering between aristocratic outrage and creeping panic. "You know this woman. This is Richard's oldest daughter. She is an unemployed dropout who has been causing scenes and harassing my future daughter-in-law all morning. Security should be removing her from the premises immediately." Jonathan turned his head slowly and looked at Charles with a perfectly flat, unamused expression. "Charles," he said coldly, "the woman standing in front of you is not an unemployed dropout. She is one of the most ruthless and highly sought-after financial analysts in the entire country. Her firm is notorious for uncovering hidden corporate liabilities. If she is standing here right now interrupting this private gathering with a locked audit portfolio, it means she has found something in your disclosures that could not wait until Monday." I took a step forward, closing the distance between myself and the executives. "He is entirely correct, Charles," I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of any familial warmth. "For the past 72 hours, my partner Evan and I have been systematically dismantling your corporate facade. We have combed through every single asset disclosure, every offshore holding account, and every corporate tax filing your accounting department submitted to the data room. You thought you were hiding your financial reality behind layers of complex subsidiary companies, but you left a clear digital trail. And I followed it all the way to the bottom." Charles took a sudden physical step backward, as if my words had struck him in the chest. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire persona he had projected for decades began to crack in real time. The other executives in the room shifted uncomfortably, sensing the massive shift in the power dynamic. They looked at me with newfound apprehension, completely erasing the image of the pathetic sister they had previously held in their minds. "This is completely highly inappropriate," Charles stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "You are bringing personal family vendettas into a multi-billion-dollar corporate negotiation. This is a massive conflict of interest. Jonathan, you cannot possibly listen to anything this woman has to say. She is clearly acting out of malicious spite because her father just kicked her out of the bridal party." My fiduciary duty is to my client, I replied smoothly, maintaining direct eye contact with the chief executive officer. When I realized the target company of our blind audit was linked to my future brother-in-law, I immediately disclosed the connection to my firm. We proceeded with the utmost professional integrity. The numbers do not lie, Charles, and they certainly do not harbor personal vendettas. The mathematics of your impending corporate ruin are entirely objective. I held up the locked brushed steel case. Inside this portfolio is the indisputable verified proof of my findings. I continued projecting my voice, so every single powerful person in the conservatory could hear me clearly. I am not the struggling failure my father desperately wants me to be. I graduated as the valedictorian of my executive business program years ago. I built a firm that generates millions of dollars in legitimate verified revenue. I have spent my entire life being mocked and belittled by people who worshipped your elite status. But the truth is, I am the only person standing in this room with actual sustainable wealth. The rest of you are clinging to a rotting, sinking ship. The absolute shock on Charles' face was a masterpiece of human emotion. He opened his mouth to formulate another desperate defense, but the heavy glass doors of the conservatory suddenly burst open with violent, aggressive force. The heavy thud of the doors striking the wooden stops echoed like a gunshot through the tense, silent room. Richard marched into the VIP reception area, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Susan followed closely behind him, her high heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. Brittany pushed her way through the doorway next, struggling against the heavy silk of her custom bridal gown, her eyes burning with malicious intent. Bradley brought up the rear, looking incredibly agitated and ready to enforce my father's cruel banishment. "Lauren, I told you to get out of this venue!" Richard roared, his voice booming across the conservatory before he had even fully processed the room. "I stripped you of your title and I cut you off completely. You do not belong here. You are nothing but a massive embarrassment to this family, and I will have the police drag you out in handcuffs if I have to." Richard took 3 aggressive stomping steps toward me, fully intending to grab me by the arm and physically drag me out of the building. But he stopped dead in his tracks when he finally noticed the silent ring of powerful executives completely surrounding me. He froze, his eyes darting frantically from Jonathan to Charles, and finally landing on the locked brushed steel portfolio, resting comfortably in my hands. The pure, unadulterated fury on his face instantly melted into a mask of deep, sickening confusion. "What is going on here?" Richard asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, uncertain whisper. "Charles, why is my daughter standing in the middle of your executive circle? Someone call security and remove her." "Nobody is removing her," Jonathan commanded, his voice cutting through my father's panic with absolute corporate authority. "She is delivering the preliminary audit report for the acquisition. Now remain quiet, Richard. We are conducting serious business." Richard looked as though the floor had just dropped out from underneath his expensive tailored shoes. Susan let out a soft, confused gasp, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest. Brittany stared at Evan and then at me, completely failing to comprehend how the sister she had just banished was suddenly commanding the respect of the wealthiest men in the country. Bradley simply stared at the brushed steel case in my hands, his face turning a stark, terrifying shade of paper white. He knew exactly what was inside. I did not waste another second. I turned my back on my stunned family and faced Jonathan directly. "As the lead consultant on this acquisition, I am officially advising your board of directors to terminate this merger immediately," I said, my voice ringing with total, absolute finality. I entered the security code into the locking mechanism of the portfolio. The clasp snapped open with a sharp, satisfying click. I pulled out the thick, bound executive summary and handed it directly to Jonathan. "Vance Global Logistics is functionally insolvent," I announced to the room, ensuring every single person heard the devastating truth. "They are completely drowning in hidden toxic debt. They have taken out massive high-interest commercial loans against every single piece of real estate and every international shipping hub they own. Their operational cash flow does not even cover the bare minimum interest payments on their leveraged assets anymore. They are bleeding millions of dollars every single month. This highly publicized mega merger is not a strategic expansion. It is a desperate last-ditch bailout. They are attempting to offload billions of dollars in toxic, unpayable debt onto your balance sheets before the bank seize everything they own. If you sign those binding acquisition agreements next week, you will completely tank your own stock and destroy your corporation overnight. Charles let out a strangled, panicked noise. "That is a complete fabrication," he shouted, stepping forward with his hands raised defensively. "Jonathan, you cannot believe this nonsense. Our public filings are completely flawless. She has manipulated the data." "Turn to page 47 of the executive summary," Jonathan Y. instructed. Ignoring Charles entirely, you will see the exact dates and amounts of the adjustable interest rate hikes that crippled their cash flow. Turn to page 82 for the complete list of shell companies they created in overseas tax havens to hide their depreciating shipping fleets. They are reporting 20-year-old scrap metal vessels as premium market assets. The entire empire is a hollow, rotting facade. They are bankrupt in everything but name. Jonathan flipped rapidly through the thick-bound document, his expert eyes scanning the undeniable math and the highlighted offshore routing numbers. The deep lines on his face hardened into a mask of pure cold corporate fury. He closed the portfolio with a loud, heavy thud and glared directly at Charles. "This is absolute fraud. Charles," Jonathan said, his voice vibrating with lethal intensity. "You tried to bury my company in your toxic garbage. You lied directly to my board of directors." "But the bankruptcy is not even the most interesting part of this audit." I continued, pivoting smoothly to face Bradley and Brittany. The entire room shifted their collective attention to the bride and groom, who were currently trembling near the heavy glass doors. Bradley looked like he was about to physically vomit. Brittany looked completely, utterly lost. While reviewing the executive expense accounts, I discovered a fascinating secondary anomaly. I said, pacing slowly toward my terrified sister. I found a massive trail of illegally embezzled corporate funds being aggressively siphoned out of the dying logistics business. Over the past 6 months, Bradley has authorized over $600,000 in direct wire transfers from the corporate operating accounts to a newly formed limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. The company is named Blue Diamond Event Management. It has no commercial address, no website, and no legitimate history of providing event services. Charles spun around to face his son, his eyes bulging with sheer horror. "Bradley, what is she talking about?" Charles demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "What wire transfers?" I did not let Bradley answer. I kept my eyes locked directly on my sister. I pulled the state incorporation documents for Blue Diamond Event Management, I told the room, my voice echoing with icy precision. The sole registered agent and owner of the dummy corporation receiving those massive fraudulent wire transfers is my sister Brittany. She has been systematically creating fake invoices for non-existent luxury wedding services, and Bradley has been blindly approving the payments using stolen corporate funds. Brittany has been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of toxic company debt directly into her personal private banking accounts to fund her extravagant lifestyle and buy designer clothes. Brittany let out a high-pitched, terrified squeak. She stumbled backward, her heavy silk gown catching on the marble floor. "That is a lie," she shrieked, tears of absolute panic welling up in her eyes. "I did not steal anything. Bradley told me I could use the corporate accounts to plan the wedding." "You committed massive federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement," I corrected her coldly, pointing directly at the financial documents in Jonathan's hands. "The routing numbers match your personal accounts perfectly. You and Bradley have been actively mutually scamming each other this entire time. Bradley thought he was marrying into a massively wealthy family who could help bail out his sinking company. But our father Richard fabricated that entire illusion of wealth. Our family is completely broke." Richard let out a loud, furious gasp, stepping forward to defend his fragile ego. "Lauren, shut your mouth!" he roared, his face twisting with rage. "We are an elite, successful family." "You have absolutely nothing, Dad," I said, shutting him down with swift, devastating force. "You secretly drained my entire college savings account years ago just to buy Brittany a luxury sports car because you were drowning in credit card debt. You rely on fake appearances and leased cars to look wealthy. You threatened to cut off my tuition today, but you have not paid a single dime toward my education in over a decade. I paid for my own degrees. I built my own firm. You are entirely broke, and you desperately needed Brittany to marry a billionaire to save your social standing. But Bradley is completely bankrupt. He has absolutely no money to support her. You are two completely destitute families desperately trying to rob each other blind. The dual family collapse was instantaneous and spectacularly catastrophic. The fake wealth facade that both families had spent decades meticulously building shattered completely into a million jagged pieces. Bradley's parents stared at Richard and Susan with pure, unadulterated disgust, realizing they were marrying their son off to penniless frauds. Richard and Susan stared at Charles and Bradley with equal horror, realizing the untouchable logistics empire they worshipped was nothing but a massive mountain of toxic, unpayable debt. Jonathan, the chief executive officer of the mega-corporation, handed the thick-bound audit report to one of his senior board members. He adjusted his suit jacket and looked at Charles with absolute contempt. "This merger is officially permanently cancelled," Jonathan announced, his voice echoing with devastating finality. "We are pulling out of all negotiations immediately. Furthermore, my legal team will be forwarding these findings regarding the wire fraud directly to the federal authorities." "You are completely finished, Charles." The corporate executives turned in unison and marched out of the glass conservatory, completely abandoning the ruined logistics empire. They left behind a room filled with screaming, panicking frauds. Charles lunged at Bradley, shouting furious obscenities about the embezzled corporate funds. Bradley screamed back, blaming Brittany for manipulating him into approving the fake invoices. Susan collapsed onto a velvet sofa, clutching her chest and sobbing hysterically as the reality of their complete social and financial destruction finally set in. I stood in the center of the total, absolute chaos, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace wash over my entire body. I had delivered exactly what I promised. I had handed them the unvarnished, undeniable truth and watched their toxic kingdom burn to the ground. "We are done here, Evan," I said, turning to my business partner who was watching the meltdown with a satisfied smirk. "Let us leave them to clean up their own mess." I walked confidently toward the heavy glass doors, the midnight blue silk of my designer gown sweeping across the marble floor. I did not look back at the screaming matches or the frantic tears. I stepped out of the VIP reception room, leaving the smoldering ruins of their fraudulent empires entirely behind me. I was the struggling dropout they had mocked and humiliated, but I was the only one walking out of that building with my head held high, my wealth completely intact and my future entirely my own. As I made my way down the quiet carpeted hallway toward the main exit, the heavy glass doors of the conservatory burst open behind me. The sounds of absolute chaos spilled out into the elegant corridor, shattering the carefully curated peace of the historic estate. I stopped and turned around simply to witness the sheer magnitude of the destruction I had unleashed. The elite, sophisticated executives had completely abandoned their refined manners. Charles was physically advancing on my father, jabbing a finger into Richard's chest. "You are a penniless con artist," Charles bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You paraded around my country club acting like you owned the world while you were completely broke. You tried to latch onto my family to save yourself from living on the street." Richard did not back down, but his defense was equally desperate and pathetic. "Do not you dare talk to me about being a fraud!" Richard screamed back, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You are millions of dollars in debt. Your entire logistics empire is a ghost town. You were going to let my daughter marry your pathetic son just so you could steal whatever money you thought we had. You are nothing but a bankrupt failure, Charles." Susan was frantically trying to pull Richard away, her pink silk dress rustling as she sobbed hysterically. She looked at Beverly, who was standing near the bar, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Beverly was staring at my mother with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. "Do not ever speak to me again," Beverly spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You are disgusting common trash. You tried to infect my family with your poverty." Brittany was sitting on the floor in the middle of the hallway, her massive custom bridal gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe, her expensive makeup running down her face in thick black streaks. Bradley stood a few feet away from her, refusing to even look in her direction. He was frantically typing on his phone, desperately trying to reach his corporate lawyers to figure out how to avoid federal prison for the wire fraud he had blindly approved. Then the screaming abruptly stopped. Richard had turned away from Charles and locked eyes with me, where I stood at the end of the corridor. I could see the gears turning in his head. The desperate animalistic panic of a man watching his entire life burn to ash suddenly shifted. He realized that the only person on earth who actually possessed the wealth, power, and corporate influence to extinguish the flames was the exact daughter he had spent 33 years emotionally abusing. Lauren, Richard shouted, his voice cracking, as he shoved past Charles and sprinted down the hallway toward me. Susan saw him running and immediately followed, her high heels clicking frantically against the polished wood floor. "Wait, Lauren, please do not leave. We need to talk about this." I stood perfectly still, watching them scramble toward me like desperate beggars. Evan stood by my side, his posture relaxed, but highly alert, ready to intervene if they tried to physically grab me. But they did not reach for me with anger this time. They stopped a few feet away, completely breathless, their faces twisted into masks of pathetic, fawning desperation. "Lauren, you have to listen to me," Richard pleaded, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "You have the power to fix this. You are the lead consultant. You have Jonathan's ear. You can go back into that room right now and tell the board of directors that the debt can be restructured. You can use your firm to build a bailout package for Vance Global Logistics. You can save the merger." I stared at him, my expression completely blank. "You want me to commit corporate malpractice and risk my entire firm to save a bankrupt company that is actively being federally investigated for wire fraud?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm. "It is not just a company, Lauren," Susan cried, stepping forward and clasping her hands together as if in prayer. "It is your sister's future. The wedding is completely ruined. The caterers are setting up the reception right now, and we have absolutely no way to pay for any of it. Bradley has no money, and we have no money. If this merger does not go through today, we will lose everything. Our friends are arriving in less than an hour. We will be the laughingstock of the entire city." "You have to fix this, Lauren," Richard demanded, though his tone was begging rather than commanding. "We are blood. You are my daughter. You cannot just stand by and watch your family be destroyed like this. Family protects family. We will make it up to you, I swear it. We will pay for your tuition. We will send the money to your university tomorrow morning. We promise." Susan nodded frantically, her fake pearls bouncing against her chest. "Yes, we will pay for your school, Lauren. And we will move your seat back to the main bridal table. You can sit right next to me and your father. We will tell everyone how incredibly successful you are. We will introduce you to all the elite guests. Just please go back in there and tell the executives that you made a mistake with the audit. Tell them the company is salvageable." The sheer delusion radiating from my parents was absolutely staggering. They were facing total financial annihilation and severe criminal investigations, yet they genuinely believed they could buy my professional integrity with a seat at a wedding reception and the promise to pay for an educational degree I had already completed 2 years ago. They thought a simple invitation to sit near their fake high society friends would miraculously erase decades of psychological torment and financial manipulation. They were offering me things that held absolutely zero value, while asking me to sacrifice an empire I had built with my own bare hands. Brittany managed to drag herself up from the floor and stumbled down the hallway toward us. She looked absolutely wretched. Her flawless bridal aesthetic was completely destroyed. "Lauren," she sobbed, her voice high and nasal, "please, if you do not save his company, Bradley is going to leave me. He is already talking to his lawyers about turning me in for the embezzlement. You have millions of dollars. You can just pay off the debts. You can pay for the wedding. You have to help me. I am your little sister. You are supposed to take care of me." I looked at the three of them standing there in their expensive clothes, completely stripped of their arrogant superiority. They were begging the struggling dropout to save their lives. They had pushed me into the dirt for 33 years, and now they were demanding that I reach down and pull them out of the grave they had dug for themselves. I let their pathetic pleading wash over me, taking a slow, deliberate breath before I finally spoke. I looked directly into my father's eyes, stripping away any remaining illusion he held about his authority over me. Exactly 1 hour ago, I said, my voice dropping to a frigid, razor-sharp tone, you stood in the bridal suite and screamed in my face. You demanded I hand over my grandmother's necklace to appease your spoiled golden child. When I refused, you told me to get out of the venue. You told me I was nothing to this family. You told me I was a failure. But most importantly, Dad, you looked me dead in the eye and officially told me that I was cut off. Richard's face turned a sickly shade of white. Lauren, I did not mean it, he stammered, taking a step toward me. I was just stressed about the wedding. I was angry. I do not care what your emotional state was, I replied, shutting him down instantly. You made a clear, explicit declaration, and I am simply honoring your wishes. You cut me off. That means I am no longer your daughter. That means I owe you absolutely nothing. I do not owe you my money. I do not owe you my firm. And I certainly do not owe you my professional integrity to save a fraudulent corporate merger. Susan let out a loud, wailing sob, covering her face with her hands. You cannot do this, she cried. We will be ruined. We will lose our home. You ruined yourselves. Susan, I told her, refusing to use the word mom ever again. You built your entire lives on a foundation of lies and theft. You drained my college savings to buy a sports car, and now you have absolutely nothing left. Enjoy the consequences of your own financial choices. I turned my attention to Brittany, who was weeping uncontrollably, clutching the ruined silk of her custom bridal gown. She looked like a terrified child who had just dropped her ice cream cone, but the reality was she had committed massive federal wire fraud. You wanted all the attention today, Brittany, I said, my voice echoing smoothly down the quiet corridor. I gestured toward the open doors of the conservatory where the shouting matches were starting to escalate again. Well, you got it. Every single person in this venue is paying attention to you right now. I hope you enjoy the spotlight because the federal investigators are going to be paying very close attention to your bank accounts by tomorrow morning. Brittany let out a horrified shriek, wrapping her arms around her stomach as if she might be physically sick. Richard opened his mouth to launch into another desperate plea, but I simply raised my hand, silencing him completely. Do not ever contact me again, I commanded. If any of you attempt to call me, email me, or show up at my office, I will have my security team physically remove you, and I will file for a permanent restraining order. This family ended for me a long time ago. Today is just the day I finally signed the death certificate. I turned my back on them. I did not wait for another response. I walked smoothly down the corridor toward the main exit, Evan falling into step right beside me. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the historic estate and stepped out into the bright, warm afternoon sun. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and spring flowers. Behind me, I could faintly hear the sounds of sirens in the distance, likely someone calling the police due to the escalating violence inside the venue. But it was no longer my problem. I walked to my car, got in, and drove away from the toxic wasteland of my past without looking back a single time. Fast forward 3 months. The fallout from the wedding day disaster was swift, absolute, and utterly devastating. The megacorporation officially filed massive lawsuits against Vance Global Logistics for corporate fraud and misrepresentation during the due diligence period. Bradley's family company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Within 2 weeks, their assets seized by predatory lenders to cover the massive hidden debts we had uncovered. My parents, Richard and Susan, were completely destroyed. Because the wedding reception had been fully catered, decorated, and set up before the cancellation, they were left holding the bag for a staggering $200,000 in vendor invoices. Bradley and his parents completely washed their hands of the event, leaving my parents to face the aggressive collection agencies alone. They were forced to sell their luxury cars and drain their remaining retirement accounts just to avoid being sued by the country club. They were currently drowning in debt, isolated from their wealthy social circle, who had completely abandoned them after the public humiliation. Brittany did not get her fairy tale ending. Bradley dumped her the exact same day the merger fell apart, desperately trying to distance himself from the embezzlement scheme to save his own skin. He claimed Brittany had acted alone in setting up Blue Diamond event management. Without Bradley's money or my parents' financial support, Brittany was forced to move into a tiny rented room in a terrible part of the city. She was currently single, unemployed, and facing multiple federal indictments for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The authorities had frozen all her bank accounts, leaving her absolutely penniless as she awaited trial. I, on the other hand, was standing on the expansive private balcony of my luxury downtown penthouse. The evening air was crisp and the city skyline glittered brilliantly against the dark night sky. The soft sounds of jazz played from the sound system inside my beautifully decorated living room. Evan walked out onto the balcony carrying 2 crystal flutes filled with incredibly expensive vintage champagne. He handed one to me and leaned against the glass railing, a relaxed, genuine smile on his face. "The final quarterly reports just came in," Evan said, clinking his glass gently against mine. "We did it, Lauren. The firm just officially closed a record-breaking financial quarter. Our revenue has tripled since the Vance audit. Every major corporation in the city wants to hire the analyst who took down an entire logistics empire before lunch." I took a slow sip of the cold, crisp champagne, letting the sweet taste linger on my tongue. I looked out over the sprawling, beautiful city that I had conquered entirely on my own terms. I had started with nothing. I had been mocked, abused, and dismissed by the people who were supposed to love me most. But I had refused to be the victim in their twisted narrative. I had built my own empire brick by brick, and I had protected it with everything I had. "To record breaking quarters," I said, raising my glass to the glittering skyline, "and to taking out the trash." I stood there on my balcony, feeling the cool wind in my hair, entirely unbothered, completely untouchable, and beautifully free. The most valuable asset you will ever own isn't a vintage diamond necklace, a luxury sports car, or a seat at an elite dining table. It is your own unshakable self-worth. For over 3 decades, my family tried to convince me that my value was tied to my compliance. They believed that success was a fragile illusion you projected to the world, funded by toxic debt and maintained through cruelty. But true power doesn't come from tearing others down to elevate yourself. True power is built quietly in the dark through hard work, education, and an absolute refusal to be defined by the people who continually underestimate you. Here are the core truths I learned from watching a fake empire crumble. Boundaries are your best defense. You do not owe your success, your money, or your loyalty to people who only claim you when it benefits their own selfish narrative. Success is the loudest answer. You don't need to scream to be heard. Let your financial independence and your undeniable accomplishments speak for you. Walking away is a victory. Removing yourself from a toxic, manipulative environment isn't giving up. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot control the family you are born into, but you hold absolute authority over the life you choose to build. When others refuse to give you a seat at their table, stop begging. Go build your own table and make sure it rests on a foundation of truth. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success? I want to hear how you reclaimed your power. Share your story in the comments below. And please hit that like and subscribe button for more stories about setting boundaries, executing the perfect comeback, and building an empire entirely on your own terms.